Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to those. I'll ask Councillor McGirt to do the opening karakia, please. All right, certainly want to.
We've done the wrong way.
Yeah, I hate that.
Well, we all know. Tua ki runga, tua ki raro, kua te roto, kua te waho, tua te hei tangata, ka ronga te apo, ka ronga te ao, humea, huea, tai.
Kia.
Thank you and well done. And so we'll move to the preliminary things before we start hearing from the submitters. So today we have 5 of the councillors in the room here at Tasman District Council, and we have Mayor Rachel Reese on Zoom and Inga, and you'd have to help me with the rest of the pronunciation, Susan, I can't even see it. Inga, the iwi rep on Zoom as well. So good afternoon to you two and everyone else. Is there any procedural things we need to do before we start hearing from submitters, Ms. Edwards?
Just maybe a reminder that we'll get the bell at 8 minutes.
Oh yeah, I'll do that in a moment. But,
Kia ora koutou katoa rangatira mā, ko aina kumura kara France. So aina kara France.
thank you.
Tēnā koe, Chair.
Chair.
Kia ora koutou, Chair. I have to, unfortunately, I couldn't reschedule an appointment this afternoon, which is why I'm joining you on Zoom. This was an additional hearing slot, and I've got an appointment I just cannot move. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave the hearing at probably around 2:45. So my apologies.
No, that'll be fine. So we'll just note that apology for our early departure. And then we'll move shortly to the first submitter, but I'll just remind for all of those on Zoom that are going to be speaking that we have 10 minutes allocated for the speaking. Bill will go at 8 minutes, so if you could sort of finish then and leave a couple of minutes for questions, which will be the panel from the panel both here and physically or on Zoom. So with that, and I know it's probably a little ahead of when we said we would start with, our first submitter is Mrs. Olivia Newbar. Tim, I see you're here. Is Olivia here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. So I think you presented last week, didn't you? Or to the walking and cycling strategy? No, there must have been someone else. My apologies.
I didn't speak. I have done a number of, it's been a busy month for submissions. I've done a written submission on that, but not a spoken submission.
Okay, that's what it was.
It's been,
it has been a busy month.
There's been a lot of submission out at the moment. I think it would be something to bear in mind for the future, that it puts quite a load on us if you want valuable consultation, to try not to schedule it all in the same month. So just by way of introduction, I'm Olivia Neubauer. I'm a business owner, a commercial lawyer, but also, and more importantly, I think in this context, I'm a parent of 3 children, aged between 2 and 12. I live out at Hope, and at the moment I'm also participating in the Reimagining Richmond South consultation, which is underway in parallel to this process. I gather it was, the area was scheduled in the 2019 FDS for consideration. As you might have gathered, I am married to Timo, who you heard from yesterday, together with others as part of the Nelson Tasman 2050 group. I fully support what they raised in their submission, and I applaud the commitment that they've made to serving the community by carrying out this very thorough review, and also in trying to engage the wider community to understand the impacts of what has been proposed in the FDS draft. My review, on the other hand, has been of a very high level nature, and as such, I'm just here to comment on a couple of key principles, outcomes, climate change and intensification. So firstly on outcomes, and I think this point has probably been made by others, but you really need to consider the linkage between what you call the outcomes in this document and the remainder of the document. And I would go further and say even the actions that you take under the strategy. How do you measure whether the outcomes have been successfully achieved? And when will you do this? Has there been verification that the strategy, that the core part of the document meets the outcomes set out at the outset? From a lay person's view, it doesn't seem that they are. And I would suspect that the person who wrote the outcomes section isn't the same person who wrote the remainder of the document. I also think that the outcomes are a bit loaded. Most importantly to me is the point about climate change. The only mentions of climate change are that I could see were in outcomes 1 and 8, noting that 8 deals with adapting to the effects, not mitigating climate change in the first place. It makes me wonder whether councils don't see themselves as having a role here in leading on mitigation. I can see that you're really busy measuring your own carbon footprints as organisations, but I challenge you to think more broadly about taking a leading role. I think you've got a chance to have a very significant impact on climate mitigation measures through the way the strategy is developed. In option 1, I think it's drawing a really long bow to say that greenhouse gas reductions can be dealt with by integrating land use and transport. I'm not exactly sure what integrating land use means, but my concern is that if you leave that option as it is, it seems to me you could suggest that you can have greenfield subdivisions, whack in a park and ride and a bus service, and you'd be able to tick that box. It's not actually reducing greenhouse gases to do so. I think you need to make outcome 1 much broader and look at how intensification more broadly supports reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. In doing so, you'd tick a number of other boxes. You'd cover your concerns regarding public transport, creating a variety of housing options, including affordable housing. You'd focus on the 20-minute town concept. You'd continue to have productive land to grow local, minimise the impact on the natural environment, and infrastructure would be more cost-effective to achieve. In terms of intensification, it is understandable that councillors would prefer to support greenfield because it's what they know, it's what developers know, and it's easy to supply because you need less landowner involvement. However, I think the council's roles here are to take a principled approach to strategy setting. If one of my children is hungry and asks for chocolate, it's my role as a parent to offer a sandwich or a piece of fruit. And often there's a quick eye roll and that deals with the demand issue. Other times, the sandwich is happily eaten because the child was actually hungry. Similarly, if developers tell us that the market wants greenfield subdivisions and they can sell 5,000 sections at the click of a finger, like I heard recently at the Richmond South reimagination consultations, then I think we need to think more deeply. What this tells me is that there are people who are probably quite desperate for a house, and that maybe, just maybe, some of those potential purchasers would consider buying an apartment or a townhouse in an existing urban area, especially if it was closer to their jobs and schools. We have got a climate emergency on our hands, let's call that the obesity epidemic, and we need to respond with the RMA version of a sandwich or a piece of fruit. In this case, that is intensification of our existing urban areas. I've not read it all, but I've read parts of the technical document. That concerns have been raised by some councillors over the reliance of intensification to achieve sufficient development capacity. And from the documents, it appears that that's resulted in the strategy drafters having taken a quite conservative approach to their intensification proposals and modelling. I would suggest rethinking this. I'm sure if councillors thought about it as a whole, they would be equally, if not more, concerned about the impact of greenfield development on climate change, and would be taking expert advice to deeply understand the likely demand and the way this could be managed. I'm certainly no expert, but we can look to other towns and cities and see that in fact there is a market for higher density living. We shouldn't be scared of intensification. It is a rich, and in my experience overseas, very rewarding way to live. For a start, there are no lawns to mow, there are lots of local parks for children to play, and there's less need for cars in your family. It's a very appealing way to live. However, it's not well known in New Zealand, particularly in areas like Nelson, Tasman, and it does need to be designed right, and that's where councils can play a significant and useful role. Interestingly, through my involvement in the Richmond South consultation process, we're actually hearing that much of the community is very protective of their existing natural and horticultural land, and resistant to the idea of the land being carved up for subdivision. So I challenge you to see yourselves and ourselves as a community as the kaitiaki of this region, and think about how we can leave it in 30 years' time, rather than how we can line the pockets of developers and landholders looking to line their own pockets. To sum it up, it seems to me that the FTS needs to go back to the drawing board. I think the detail set out in Nelson Tasman 2050 submission really highlights some significant gaps in the current council thinking. And as a region, we can and we should do better. We owe it to my children, your children, grandchildren. Some deeper thinking is needed to come up with a smarter approach to deal with not only today's issues, but those we know will develop over the next 30 years. We have a real depth of experience in this region, and as well as, I think, support in our community for this approach. I'd also, as a side note, encourage you to put the brakes on the Richmond South project, because it strikes me that this is heading in the wrong direction in the hands of consultants with disregard for the bigger picture. It seems inappropriate to me to be proceeding with that project because it was allocated for development under the 2019 FDS when that same FDS is under review. So I think that that should be put on hold until the direction has been set as part of this strategy, because it will have very long-term consequences. Thanks for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for your submission. I've seen
Olivia.
Really, I'm thinking about the next submitter. My apologies.
Right.
Councillor Eager has a question.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Olivia, we've heard from, we have heard what you've said from a number of submitters, which is great. What we've also heard, so for example, a submitter yesterday was saying, they really didn't want greenfield development because they wanted to have, big rural life blocks and didn't want, they'd lived in intensified areas, thought they were dreadful for their children. And so they wanted the big lifestyle section for their children. And therefore other families should live in intensified areas and not have greenfield areas. So there is a slight, hypocrisy in that argument. Now, I'm not suggesting you're making that argument, but I guess I'm saying, how do we reconcile that, people who might have the large sections themselves or the lifestyle blocks themselves are going, we want other people to live in intensified housing. We want other people to have a lifestyle that we don't want.
If you're talking about me, yes, I do live on a big lifestyle.
I'm not talking about you. I don't know where you live.
I live on a big lifestyle block. I've also lived in apartments and in various countries around the world, and I think it's a wonderful life. If I could live a parallel life, it would be in an apartment in Nelson. Well, I'd have several parallel lives, but that would be one of them. In central Nelson, where I could walk to the market and my kids could walk to school and they wouldn't have to worry about getting run over trying to bike across a road at 80 kilometres an hour, and there'd be footpaths, but I can't, and this is my one life. But I think this doesn't suggest, and none of the proposals do, that we do away with the variety. We just think that rather than building a lot of subdivisions, which seems to be the direction that this FDS is going, is that you can provide more variety. There are lots of people, and I take your point about the person you referred to yesterday, and I didn't hear them speak, but there are a lot of people in the world who very happily live in apartments and townhouses and terraced houses and a variety of homes in between. And I think it's wrong to extrapolate one person's views on what other people should and shouldn't have to live with across the population. I think at the moment they're not provided with much choice, and they haven't had the opportunity. Many of the developers, when I'm in the Richmond South development, they don't have any idea about other alternatives to having these little turtle colonies with a house with this tiny bit of garden around the outside and a big garage out the front. And I think it is something we could really do with, is to have that variety. It also provides for mixed use, for low income home options, and a whole lot of things which we don't currently have.
Thanks. And then if I can come from the same question from a really different angle, is a lot of submitters have said that intensification, one of the keys to that is the amenities, having the parks and the gardens and the other things within the walking distance. So what would be your experience that would, I guess, support people to, what are those other elements we would need that would support people into intensified living?
Well, I think you've set it out there, and I think, you know, we were in Nelson yesterday. I took my kids, and there isn't a park in central Nelson. There's no green space. You know, it's very hard to take your kids outside. If I lived there with my children, I would be very happy in an apartment if I could be outside sometimes, because they don't want to be inside. Well, they might, but they can't be inside all the time. You know, we need to create that balance so it becomes a really attractive option. Attractive for me, it may not be the same for everyone, but not having to get in your car to do all these jobs that we do all the time, you know, not having to get in your car to drive to work would be wonderful. And I think you just need to look at getting that comprehensive development design in place to make sure that then I think it becomes something people want to live in. We're not talking about, you know, 20-story skyscrapers in a concrete wonderland. I think that's very unattractive.
Yeah.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you for your submission. Time's well and truly up, so we'll move on to our next submitter. So thanks for making the effort to make a submission and giving up your time to talk to us today. And we'll move on to Sarah Whittle.
Hello.
Hello. Good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Good. I'm just trying to work out how to share. Sorry, a moment here. I want to just share a portion of my screen, so not all of it, so I can see my notes. Moment. Sorry, I am getting there. I've not done it in this way before. Okay. So can you see just the slide?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, lovely. Tēnā hui hui mai tātou, e mihi ana ki te kaupapa o te rā, no Ingarangi aho, ke hope oe noho ana. I te puaki au I Hastings ki Ingarangi, ko Sarah Whittle toku ingoa. E ai ki te whakatauki. Ma whero, ma pango, ka oti ai te mahi. No reira, kia rite te mahi tahi, tēnā ki tēnā, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora. The whakatauki I've shared today means with red and black, the work will be complete, and it refers to being ready to work together, each and every one of us, and the need for collaboration between whero, representing the chiefs, the leaders, and pango, which represents the community or the workers. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. As you've probably worked out, I originate from the UK, but I'm now a committed New Zealand citizen, I hope you can tell, that loves to learn. I'm not a professional urban designer, a planner, or an economist, but I am someone who cares deeply about the place where we live and the people who live here. As Olivia said, we are the kaitiaki, the guardians of the land, and I'm here to talk generally about how I feel about the future of this area, and I've left the technical aspects to others. As a side note, I'd like to ask the project team, whilst thinking about children and our future generations, has anyone actually approached the local colleges and MIT to ask students, the ones that this actually impacts, how they see their future, where they would like to live?
Yes, we have engaged with them.
Good, lovely. So I grew up in Battle in East Sussex. It's founded about 1,000 years ago in 1066 after the Battle of Hastings. So it's about 900 years before the car was invented. On the right-hand photo is Battle High Street from the top of Battle Abbey. The Abbey Green in the foreground was the car park in my childhood. And this has been reverted back to an open space, which is used for markets, bonfire night, and an Easter marbles match. And behind Battle, as you can see in the bottom left-hand photo, is green fields and countryside. And this is actually where the battlefield, where it took place. I'd also like the committee to reflect back on the homes that you lived in when you moved out of your parental home. I moved into terraced houses. These are the ones I lived in, walking distance from town centres and close to amenities. Suburbia would never have been an option for me at that age and stage. Why would I want to live somewhere too large that I have to drive a car to get anywhere? I'm wondering where the young adults in our region live. I'm presuming a lot are still with their parents, as there's little in the way of the first rung on the housing ladder that they can afford, or they live somewhere else in a different region. I'd also like to ask the committee to consider where or how you would like to live in 30 years' time. What if you're no longer able to afford to drive? There is a reason why Olive Estate and the like are super popular. I called Olive Estate this morning. There's a 2 to 3 year waiting list to get into one of their accommodations. The compact living spaces that are walking, e-biking distance from Richmond with a cafe and community amenities on site are very appealing. But this type of living doesn't have to be in a retirement village. There are other members of the community of all ages and stages who would greatly benefit from living in this way without being tied to the rules and regulations of the retirement village model. The point I'm making is that the recent developments that have sprawled out over the fields of Richmond in the 12 years since I moved here are not particularly suitable for large amounts of the population. Yes, they're suitable for families, but we have enough family 3 to 4 bedroom homes. We need a diverse range of accommodation. We also need a crystal ball. This slide shows some of the questions that as humans we need to address, and this is the sort of thing I think about. And I'd like to suggest, as others have, that the FDS looks further than 30 years ahead. There's a podcast, John Richardson and the Futurenauts, which is a great way to explore what comes next. It's very entertaining. There's quite a few F-bombs, but I really recommend it because they ask these questions. What is the future of the office, the future of families, the future of the economy? Like Olivia said, I also understand the councils have many concurrent plans happening, including the walking, cycling strategies, reimagining Richmond South, and so on. Surely these should be planned after the FDS, which overarches everything else. And so in light of recent times, may I suggest that the decision makers pivot. We are at a turning point where we can go back to what we know or take brave steps towards a future that is without doubt going to have to look very different to where we are today. And I only really have time to look around car transport today. So here's Richmond, developed in the 20th century after the car was invented. The FDS indicates the area in pink as earmarked for intensification. If I zoom in, as a layperson, I cannot fathom why Richmond CBD is completely missed off the area for intensification. Surely this is where we're intensifying first. So my challenge to you is to look at Richmond CBD with fresh eyes. What if we planned the main centres in our region for people rather than cars? What makes a vibrant, lively town? The people in it. What is Richmond like in the evening and night times? Completely dead. What if people lived in the town centres instead? So Richmond, this is how I see it. It features for cars. Cars, cars, cars. New Zealanders love their cars. Richmond is full of car yards and car-based services in prime real estate right in the centre of both CBDs, Nelson as well. You can buy cars, park cars, feed your car fuel, get it groomed, give it new shoes and take it to the doctor. But my question is, if you can afford to drive a car, could you not drive to a car yard or a mechanic or a petrol station outside the CBD? For families on a budget, cars are expensive to buy and run and only depreciate in value. If a household is able to give up a car, they will make huge savings, they may be able to afford to live in a better home, and they will also reduce the traffic on the roads. People are forced to own 2 cars, as otherwise they cannot get themselves or their families to school or work here. So how do we do this? We need to focus on reliable and cost-effective public transport, safe walk and cycle ways. I was told today that a family were asked to pay $1,000 a year to get their daughter on a bus from Annesbrook to Garrin College. Where is their incentive to take public transport? All those families are driving their kids because they're not able to afford $1,000 each. Not only that, but the internal combustion engine is being phased out far more rapidly than we might have predicted. What will happen to all these car-related businesses then in 30, 50 years' time? If people live in and close to the town, then they will not need to rely on the car to get to shops, work, schools, etc. As an aside, with more people working from home, there will be a downturn in workers using cafes and restaurants. This has recently been seen in the cafes around the government buildings in Wellington. We need to be prepared for this to happen. By moving people back into the CBD or just into the CBD, we'll keep customers in town. Lots of cities in Europe are reverting back to being walkable and banning cars from their centres. Shouldn't we be learning from this? So some photos. Here's the new developments, the countdown in Richmond with an empty car park. I noticed that the low emission cars are segregated. They have to park, they're excluded from the main car park and go into around the edge. The Waimea Funeral Home next door had only 6 cars in it when I passed at lunchtime yesterday. I know that spaces are needed in car parks, but they're car parks all over Richmond, in private businesses and so on, along the streets and at the supermarket. We need to be flexible in the use of these spaces, not just over space, but within time as well. And the future development strategy and reimagining Richmond take about the need for development. If this need is so great, then how come these new commercial developments are sitting empty, such as the bottom right photo, the shops on the side of Countdown? Who is doing the maths and what's going on? So I reference an article by William Samuels that was in Stuff in April. Basically, through utilising existing council assets, along with strategic land purchases, together with land parcelling, master planning, project oversight and infrastructure coordination, council could play an active role in ensuring comprehensive intensification that's not only capable of meeting housing demand, but delivers high quality urban outcomes. How can we do this? Well, we need a crack team of local urban designers and associated professionals. We need sympathetic, cohesive urban designs that meets the people's needs, not the developers' wants. We work with public transport, cycleways, walkable spaces. We don't actually need greenfield development. We have green spaces in the towns, and there's incentives for developers to build in the towns. What incentives are these? So I'm going to suggest a traffic light system.
Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're at 12 minutes now and we have only allocated 10.
Oh, I've got 3 slides to go.
Okay, then.
Very quickly. So can I suggest, I'll just.
If you can just paraphrase them, please.
Sure, will do. I'll suggest a traffic light system with development levies on a sliding scale, which increases as you move away from the CBD. So in green, no development levies. Orange has a 75% reduction in levies. Within the red zone, 50% reduction, and outside the red zone is the highest cost to develop. To do that, the outcomes, this is a high vision, but we need to aim high. And I thoroughly recommend the video Suburbia is Subsidised, which explains the great return on investment that you can get from building where if you don't sprawl, where a city decides not to sprawl and has remained solvent. Really, this is what I want to say. Make the ugly spaces beautiful before turning the beautiful spaces ugly. And I'll finish with this whakatauki, which speaks to the importance of permanence of land. People come and go, land remains. We rely on the land and we must think long term and see the big picture to sustainability of the land. So my challenge, please walk around Richmond and Nelson CBDs with fresh eyes, see how much opportunity there is, and within the land that we have already altered before we dig into new ground. Thank you. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I'll just see if anyone's got one quick question, particularly those on Zoom. Appears not. So thank you very much, Sarah, for your presentation. I just wonder, would you be able to send that presentation through for the record?
Yes, I will do. There's several links in it, so I will send it through very shortly.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to the next submitter. That is Mark Lyle for CCKV and Bayview Nelson. Mark, I think you're there.
Kia ora, yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Yeah, so Mark, you've just heard me 10 minutes per submitter.
Yeah, I believe I've got 2. Sorry.
Susan will ring the bell at 8. Yes, so yeah, but you'll do them as separate submissions, won't you?
Oh, well, then I definitely won't need 20 minutes. So there you go. For those who don't know me, my name is Mark Lyle. I'm a resource management consultant based in Nelson. I came to Nelson in 1994 and I had 6 years at the City Council in Nelson, where I cut my teeth as a graduate, and I've had 22 years in private practice in my own business here in Nelson, doing a lot of work in Tasman as well and further afield. I just think that's important background for those who haven't come across me before, because of course over the last 22 years Nelson and Tasman have both grown substantially, and because of my my day job, I guess you could say we're very much hands-on involved in a large majority, I would say, of the greenfield and intensification projects within both these main centres and the smaller satellite centres. So we have built up a considerable amount of experience working in a range of different teams over time and with both councils. So now, most immediately, I'm the lead consultant for the private plan change request land, who I'm talking on behalf of today, the CCKV Untitled Development company, and also Bayview Nelson. It's a joint plan change involving 287 hectares of land, basically on Nelson's doorstep. Hopefully everyone I'm speaking to today are very familiar with the very close proximity of that site to Nelson City. And obviously it's, well, physically it's 2.6 kilometre drive from Nelson Cathedral. It really literally only takes 2 turns from the end of Niall Street to get to the site boundary, at least from Ralphine Way, from the Cathedral to Ralphine Way, and is very well connected to Nelson City with alternative tracks and pathways, as you'll appreciate. My submission, which obviously was in a written submission, covering a number of pages. I don't propose to go through that at length. Hopefully you've had a bit of time to skim over that or read over that. I guess just some very key points from our submission is that we're very appreciative of being included in the FDS. The subject site, obviously, because of its attributes, ranks very high on the list in terms of ticking the relevant boxes and the qualities of land that you're looking forward to achieve well-functioning urban environments. I have made some comment in my submission about some of those assessments in terms of rankings, but I don't think I need to go into any of that particular detail today. I guess one of the key questions and discussions that the council is faced with is this issue of intensification versus greenfield. As my submission clearly, I believe, sets out and is supported by the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, it's important that both regions really embrace and provide for both forms of development. Obviously, there's lots of different opportunities in different locations, but not everyone wants to live in an apartment. Not everyone can afford an apartment. And the NPS is very clear about providing for the needs of all people, including the diverse and changing needs of people, to meet the needs in terms of type, price, and location of different households. So I would say it's very important that you take that national direction seriously and think about why those words are used. Both have a very valid place in the strategy. We're not opposing at all the role played by intensification. In fact, we would support intensification, but it needs to be aligned with a strategy that is realistic and provides for those wide ranging needs. Now, just one of the key things I've also pointed out in my written submission is that, and this is acknowledged somewhat in the FDS as a draft, is that there is some hesitation around putting too much priority on intensification because of the take-up is likely to be relatively slow. And I think that would be strongly influenced by price and cost and risk and complexity. If you only have to look around the real estate pages to actually try and find, if you try and find an affordable apartment, you're dreaming. If you try and find an affordable townhouse, you're dreaming. So if you keep in mind the demographics in terms of people's ability to buy a house, think about how many people can afford more than $1 million for something brand new in town. I think that's a significant consideration, and it will have an ongoing long-term impact on you achieving your intensification goals. I probably prefer to simply just answer some questions rather than take up too much more time, because I think I've set it out pretty clearly in my submission.
Thank you, Mark. And We do have some time for questions. So Councillor McGurk, firstly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, through you. Mark, we've had submitters present to us, both written and verbally, discussing that the fact that we've got greenfield developments suppresses, I'm not sure that's the right word, but it distorts the demand for intensification. Is that greenfield is, to use your word, is probably cheaper, easier to produce, and that for a development point of view, and because that's easier done, that's the option that's taken by developers, and they don't. And the intensification option is sort of subverted. I just wondering if you got a comment about that. I'd just be interested, from your professional view that you might have.
Well, I mean, that's assuming if there wasn't greenfields, people would still want to live in an apartment. I don't think that's the case. I think simply it would mean people would look for a greenfield development or site, maybe in Tasman as opposed to Nelson, if we just think about the opportunity here in Nelson City. So that would mean more people in cars further out of Nelson if this is where the jobs are. But if that's that's the type of format that they actually choose to live in, as opposed to an apartment, it'll mean that they'll just choose to live in Tasman, basically. So I think having a greenfield option on this side of the Bishopdale Hill has a significant advantage too for our transport network. There's a lot of people who live in town that would love to have an opportunity to have a section to build their own house on and live in a greenfield setting, and not necessarily in a townhouse or an apartment in the city. So there's different needs, and I think it's important you provide for all of those needs.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Maley.
Good afternoon,
Yeah, your mic's not on. Then close.
Afternoon, Mark. I just want to talk to you about brownfield development in relation to what incentives do you think would assist? Because certainly in Richmond, the ones that we've got going here, you're right, the ones closest to the council are 1.2 million, the townhouses that are currently being built. But there is one in Salisbury Road, which is certainly at a lower end, the ones opposite Waimea College, where there's 24 going in. But it's quite a different concept because there won't be garages and they're attached. So similar to what we saw from the English lady just before you. So are there some extra incentives that you think would help us in this brownfield development in the inner city?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Obviously, the council can only do so much. Having a rule framework in place, which I know Nelson City's definitely working on, will help. But I mean, land price to start with, capital investment already on those properties. And if you look at page 8 of the submission I made, there's a long list of costs that actually have to be faced in any of these types of developments. I've been involved in almost all of those under construction and recently completed construction. These are projects that are 3 or 4 years in the making. Some of them have only just started. They're long, they're expensive. Some of them have had to change. One across the road from me here on Halifax Street was scaled back because of the steel and concrete prices. There's only so much the councils can do, but providing a planning framework will help. But that's not. There's a lot more to it, and I think just financial realities are going to have a significant impact on those numbers that we see created by intensification.
Councillor Ogilvie.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. And Mark, one of the, I suppose, frequent comments from submitters has been the loss of high quality, versatile soils, particularly around the Waimea Plains. And the phrase you mentioned was the the long-term impact. And the concern has been, what is the long-term impact of that sort of development, and how much more of this can we sustain?
Yeah,
Because, the population growth, I think we're told that about 75% of the population coming into Nelson, Tasman, over the age of 65, and putting them onto these areas, it probably isn't that practical either. So where do you see the future?
It's a good question. I guess first and foremost for the Maitahi Bayview plan change, that's low quality productive land. It's basically forestry land. If it was to ever be attempted to be used for rural purposes, it would be in forestry, but thankfully it hasn't. It's been an unproductive sheep farm for a number of decades. So just want to put that out there. We're not talking about productive soils in that location. Ironically, the valley floor is actually zoned already for rural residential development. So if you were to look at productive valleys on that property, it's zoned for development already. So that's a goner, that issue. But in terms of Waimea, definitely that is obviously something much more relevant to Tasman, I believe. And I guess I'm no expert in productive values, but I'm going to speak in a moment about the land in Wakefield, immediately adjoining the Wakefield village, and that's not productive land like you have on the Waimea Plains. So it's definitely a relevant consideration, and I can hear your concern over that. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it and give you the answer, but having regard to productive values will be important long term. Yes.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah,
Deputy Mayor.
yeah, Mark, just a really quick question of clarification, because I know we're basically at time. And I don't know if you've seen it, but the covering submission summary, and it may be that I've missed it, says, CCKV and Bayview landowner N106 supports its inclusion and requests extension. Is there an extension request in there somewhere that I missed in your actual submission?
No, I don't think so. That's definitely not what I was seeking.
Okay, great. It's just because that is in the formal record. I just wanted to clarify, because I sort of read it twice, didn't see an extension request, and but just thought, okay, somehow I might have missed it. I've had a lot of pages to read. Okay, so I think we need to get that corrected for the record. Thank you.
Perhaps you could just check and let us know, Mark, and your post your submission. Yeah, Inga, and we'll come to you first and then to Mayor Rees.
Kia ora, Mark.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, Mark. Koina Kara France Te Koinga. Look, I was really interested about your submission, to hear your submission. I just want to hear your thoughts in regards to this particular question that I'm going to present. So research has shown that when you cluster low-income families, you have a high raft of negative impacts and high statistical data outcomes. What are your thoughts about that in terms of diversifying income brackets within this housing strategy or future development strategy?
I guess one part of my answer would be for the plan change. We're very fortunate to have a site that is suitable for a very wide range of housing typologies. We're also very fortunate to have Ngāti Koata as a partner in that project, who are very, very involved in making sure we provide for that range of needs in terms of affordability. So, yeah, I think what we're looking for the plan change, for the plan change site, probably somewhat answers that issue where, you're not just putting the low income people in one location and sort of, closing them off. I'm not saying this is the case here whatsoever. We're providing for a well-balanced community here with a range of different types of housing typologies that I think will work well together.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mayor Rees.
Kia ora, Mark. Mark, this is just a quick general question, because you have provided information around the cost of development and also your knowledge around the market across both Nelson and Tasman. We have had submissions on the integrity of the economic analysis, suggesting that perhaps it's not where it needs to be. So we had a submission from Kainga Ora, which was supported by a property economics expert report. I'm interested in the hearing, just so we're very transparent. Given your knowledge across the region, I'm interested in sort of sense checking that evidential basis. Is that something that you would be willing to be part of as a sense checking exercise? It's not directly to your submission, and we can just, and the officers can raise this with you outside the hearing, but I just want, for transparency, make sure that I have raised it in the hearing.
Yeah, no, I don't get asked very often to help, but from that side, but I'm certainly willing to. I think I've got a lot to offer. But I could also say that economically, with the plan change, we're going through expert witness conferencing at the moment, which I'm pleased to record that the economists have reached an agreement that's been signed. So for the subject plan change, site plan change 28, that's now on the council's website, that joint witness statement, which confirms there are significant economic benefits from that plan change 28. So I guess that might help, at least in terms of this submission anyway.
Right, thank you. That might be something we just need to note for taking into account as we go through in terms of further information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So Mark, that has only left you 5 minutes for the Whittle developments, but so I'm hoping that you can race through what you need to say about that for us.
Yeah, sure. So obviously very separate site and different location. It's in Wakefield, immediately joining the existing Wakefield village. It's the Wakefield developments are a client who are very actively developing sections in Wakefield, and they own a significant piece of land. Well, they've got extra residential land that they're working through, but there's also another very large piece of land that has another 170 or 180 lots that have been master planned within that adjoining area. It's currently zoned rural. We've been working hard with council as a part of coming up with, well, for starters, being a partner to the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund with TDC. We've looked at providing for a range of housing typologies, which is something the council's really encouraged us to do. We've addressed flooding risks. We've got a cultural impact assessment and done iwi consultation. There's some significant benefits to come forward there in terms of Te Mana o Te Wai. We've got a fantastic opportunity to provide for a community recreational area that would, I mean, in this location in Wakefield, immediately adjoining the cycleway. It's a significant opportunity within a big stand of oaks as well. And the client has been very active talking to the Wakefield community. So again, on behalf of the Wakefield developments, clients very much appreciate being a part of the Tasman component of the FDS. It's a greenfield site adjoining the Wakefield community. So you know, it's close, and it very much makes sense to be part of the FDS.
Thank you, Mark. Just a question firstly from myself around that. I think you meant to say a stand of totras and one significant large oak tree, but we did have a submitter yesterday ask about developers leaving mature trees on subdivisions, and this subdivision would be an ideal opportunity to do that, as there's quite a significant number of totra trees in and around the cycle trail and on the side of this property. Do you know if the developer's going to do that?
Yes, it's we've been working with the reserves team. They obviously very quickly would like to see that stand of totra within a reserve, and that's part of the master plan. So yeah, definitely achieving those outcomes.
Yeah, I'm sure that would be greatly supported by the Wakefield community. Yeah. Councillor Ogilvie, did you have a quick question?
Yeah, just a quick question, Mark. In your submission, you've got a list from A to H of what you're considering of the subdivision proposal. And I'm just suggesting, perhaps, given the comments throughout our FDS submissions, add an I there, which would mean to consider climate change in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Is that appropriate, or could that be done in terms of where we're coming from as our future vision for the district, and particularly in this case for Wakefield?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fortunately here we're not near any sea level rise risks, and neither is the Maitai site, I should say. But yeah, climate change, being close to the city, close to the community centre, where there's not necessarily a full reliance on vehicles, that'll help, and management of stormwater in an integrated way would also be part of that.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Ika, last and quick question.
Yeah, just in the list of considerations, there's just no comment about the productivity of the land. Can you tell me about that site? Yeah,
so it's really just been a grazed block for a long time. It's been a sheep farm. I know that from there being a hail site that they're dealing with currently within the residential zone, and so it's not horticultural. It's not horticultural land. It's basically grazing land. So it doesn't have the same high horticultural values as you would see on the Waimea Plains.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Ika. So thanks very much for your submission, Mark. You really appreciate your submission and coming in and speaking to us and answering the questions. So with that, we'll move on to the next submitter, which is Eleanor Greenoff.
Hello.
Hi, Eleanor. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Can I get started?
You can. You'll have a bell in 8 minutes.
I probably might take 8 minutes, 15 seconds. It was a group of very concerned neighbours who alerted me to the T136 proposal, part of the FDS. The time constraints put on the FDS by the council are also very short. I'm totally opposed to the loss of productive farmland for greenfield developments. I do recognise the need for more houses and growth in the region, but it should be intensification in existing housing areas which already have existing infrastructure, not just random housing, increasing urban sprawl on land that can be used to produce food, not where a developer can make a quick buck because the job is easy. I've taken the time to read most of the submissions to the FDS questionnaire, particularly questions 30 and 31, and feel that they in particular are misleading, and the rest of it is very slanted from beginning to end to give the writer of the survey the outcome that they desire. I object very strongly to T136, which appears in the FDS document as a secondary proposal as part of the Tasman village, and now seems to be a totally different proposal with an even bigger area of land involved than just the Malcolm consortium of land at Braeburn Road. Mr. Malcolm did approach me to see if I was interested in his proposal, and when I asked him about it, he stated that the council had approached him to put his land forward and any other blocks he could gather around his block. This seems very strange when the FDS document states this land is a secondary development and is not needed for future development, even under a high growth scenario. There is a huge danger that there is going to be a new town placed in the middle of nowhere on highly productive land. No infrastructure available, the Moutere Highway barely coping with existing traffic, and certainly not going to be a carbon neutral proposal. The people and locals who have objected to T136 have no idea of the scope of the new proposal, because it was not until I read the Malcolm submission that I realised that his proposal was much more significant than what had been published as part of the FDS. This area of Braeburn should be classified as a significant natural area with its hills rising to the skyline when viewed from the Mootry Valley, and it should never be allowed to be built on. I've been told by the TDC that the wetlands on my property are in the top 10% in the region. I cannot see how T136 will be developed without extensive earthworks, which when runoff occurs during development will risk smothering and destroy the wetlands on my property and all the biodiversity that is in them. I have farmed on Mootry clay all my life, firstly at Tasman and for the last 22 years at 2284 Mootry Highway and Braeburn Road. The home farm backs onto the Chisholm Block and Hutton Hayden Payne Partnership. The home block on the north corner runs up to Kirkwood Road and neighbours the south of T136. The Braeburn Road block is below Tasman View Road and is bordered on the south side by T136 block, and Moana Orchards block border me on the north side. Mootry clays are highly productive land if you know how to manage them. Not only is it good pastoral land, but grows good apples and grapes. One local is also trialling saffron with some success on terraces on Mootry clay. Once land is built on, it's gone forever for food production. The land around here is what I would describe as good early country, and then it grows grass and crops later into the autumn and starts growing grass earlier in the spring than further south. It also has the issue that it can be summer dry country and one has to farm accordingly. I run over 2,000 equivalent stock units on 168 hectares of land, which works out at about 12 stock units per hectare, with sheep scanning to 168% for lambing. My farm is similar lands to T136. Loss of productive farmland will only lead to even more expensive groceries. There are always huge problems when urban and rural areas try to intermingle, particularly for the farmers who are just trying to go about their day-to-day business. It is stated in the Malcolm proposal that T136 area is ex-pine tree country, but it is not good productive farmland. I believe that the photos that were sent through to you disprove this and show that the leasee of T136 land has achieved on this property through direct drilling and good farming practices, and particularly this year in a very dry autumn. The lessee of T136 is Alliance Group's third biggest supplier of lambs in all of New Zealand. He would not be bothering with the farm unless it was worth his while. The photos are of the front part of the farm, which is the easier country and also has a reticulated stock water system. The back of the farm against Tasman View Road is very much steeper and is reliant on ponds, so has not been as intensively farmed as the front country. It works very well to graze stock on that country and then bring them forward onto paddocks of plantain or raffinose to finish the lambs to the required weight for the freezing works. Grazing plantain also reduces the amount of methane animals produce. If the panels would look at the photos I have sent through to support my submission, I will expand on them. Image 4037 shows a paddock of turnips for fattening lambs on. From a neighbour's observation, I believe this is part of the rotation before plantain is planted. Image 4040 shows a paddock of plantain waiting for lambs to be moved onto it. Figure 4, image 4044 shows some young grass. Image, oh, I've got that wrong, 404 shows an area of the farm with good quality feed available for fattening lambs. I would ask the question of the councillors, does this look like unproductive land to you? I believe that also that T136 is not suitable for housing because of previous slippage that has occurred and the burying of pine stumps when the land was originally developed. Buried infrastructure will always be at risk of ground slumping. Image 4052 shows a small slump near Kirkwood Road. Image 4058 shows a significant slip that occurred after rain a few years ago. It's been tidied up and is starting to recover. Image 4062 and 4072 the same photo at different distances showing small slips and slumps. Image 4063 shows some slumps on a relatively flat bit of T136. I wonder what is buried under here. Image 4048 and 4049 show what an outstanding natural landscape this area is. It also shows that it is good productive farmland and it is situated a long way from any services. With $5 million views like this, there will be no affordable housing here, which is one of the proposed outcomes of the FDS. The Great Tasman Bike Trail also goes along Tasman View Road, which is on the top edge of T136 and the other properties that have been added lately to the Malcolm proposal. From Harley Road to Riverside Community, it has views like this going alongside productive farmland. If this land is built on, it will spoil the views. One of the reasons people bike this trail is to get away from urban areas. I would ask the council to scrap the Malcolm proposal to the FDS and give any building in this area now and in the future no further consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. We do have some time for questions if there is any. Does anyone have any questions? Councillor Ogilvie.
Just to say thank you very much, Eleanor, for your submissions. Very clear, very straightforward. Thank you.
David.
Thank you. Ina.
Thank you, Chair. Kia ora, Eleanor. Thank you very much for your submission. You mentioned in your submission regards to a reference to Te Raupaha, but you didn't expand on that. Would you like to just elaborate?
My elaboration was that, from my understanding, was that when he came down from the North Island, he landed at Kina. He chased the local iwi out from there, and my understanding was that they went right from Tasman all through the Mootree to try and get away from him, not just the battlefield up behind Williams Road.
Okay, was that in reference to the sites and significance of that particular area?
Well, it's in reference that I believe that there is cultural significance to the whole Mootree area.
Okay, that's really great. Thank you. In regards to the reference to your particular statement finding regarding Te Raupaha and that site significance, do you have evidence that you could send through supporting?
No,
okay.
I don't. It's only what I was told as a child when I lived in Tasman.
Right. Well, look, thank you.
One has to accept that, you know, stories are fed down through generations.
Absolutely, and totally given that evidence is valid. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. That appears to bring us to the end of the questions. So once again, thank you very much for your submission, and we'll move on to the next submitter. Bruno Lemke. Bruno, are you there somewhere?
Yes, I'm here.
Good afternoon.
There's a PowerPoint. Good afternoon, everyone. Kia ora koutou. My presentation is a very narrow presentation looking at the public green spaces in the TDC. My background is I'm on the exec of the Mapua District Community Association. I'm also in the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, a coordinator there. The Community Association has seen my previous presentation, which was to the Reserves Management Plan, which happened about 3 or 4 weeks ago, which, David, I'm sure you remember. And the comments that I make have been endorsed by the group in the community, in the Climate Forum, the transport group. The time frame is too short to actually represent either of those groups. So this is my personal presentation based on my experience with those two groups. There's a PowerPoint, or do I show my PowerPoint?
Can we do that from here, lady? Oh, it's been circulated, but if you want to do...
Oh, can I do that? All right, share screen. Cool. Thank you. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
All right. Okay. I know the future development plan is about people, but I want to bring the focus of nature in because, like, if anyone's seen the recent series by David Attenborough, nature and humans are intimately involved, and we've created a lot of damage to nature. And I'm not going to go into the details. I presented some of that in the reserves management plan. The first point is that Rube Mapua has got less than 2% public green space, as you can see from the map there. And it was very simple. I just simply broke it up into grid space, counted the green space, which is supplied by the TDC, and it's about 2%. And like, it compares nothing to places like Wellington, which is about 50%, Auckland, Christchurch, and even Nelson can deliver a higher proportion of public green space.
Bruno,
yes?
We'll just get you need to move on to the next page. Next slide.
Because I'm too slow or what?
No, because we're still looking at the first slide.
Oh, I've got this. Sorry, can you not see that?
We can see the first one. What I'm saying to you is that you need to move on to the next slide.
Well, I'm on the second one. Is that, can you see that one?
No.
All right, there's something gone wrong here. All right, let me do it. Let me do it. Let me do it this way. Let me do it this way.
That's the way.
Well, okay. All right. Okay, so that slide shows the green space in Nelson. As I said, that's the 2% that I calculated. And the question is, why does that happen? Well, first of all, if you look at the strategies, the rules, the regulations, it says 5% or maybe 5.5% of developments need to be set aside for public green space. And of course, this is nowhere near 5.5%. And then another regulation that people should be within 500 metres of public green space. Now, what happens with that is you end up with each development donating 5.5% or whatever of public green space, and you end up with all these scattered green spaces all around the place with each development, which is 500 metres or so from the people living that development. It doesn't make sense. It's not conducive to nature. And a good example of that is the recent development Mapua Rise. Here's their green space. It's called Catherine Reserve. And what is it? It's two sections of green mowed weed. And that's all it is. Now, honestly, that isn't conducive to nature. So we need to think about what we're doing to our public green space. Wildlife doesn't flourish in quarter-acre blocks surrounded by houses. There are no corridors where wildlife can move to if there's any climate change, increase in temperature to move to cooler places, rise in sea level so they can move away from the deeper water. And the 5% or less is a token gesture. It is entirely focused on human activity. And then what about the high development that's been proposed for places like high density development proposed for Mapua and Wakefield? 5% is for, say, 10 families per hectare. Now we're talking about up to 20 families per hectare. Surely that 5% needs to go up because the population is now going to be greater per hectare. And the last point, which I want to spend a bit more time on, which came up yesterday with Lou's presentation, Lou Gallagher's presentation, and it's happened before, is what happens is developers purchase land, then keep it for a farm for a couple of years, and then where they can move the soil around because you're allowed to do that on the farm without any consent. And then they, after that point, after the soil's been moved, then they put it up for a subdivision. And that happened very clearly with a subdivision just above Aranui Park. Now, there's a recent subdivision that's happened, the one along Seaton Valley. And so what I did is I got the the maps of the from the TDC about coastal hazards, and this shows the mean high water mark. And you can see that this central area here is where this new subdivision is going to go. And the mean high water, not the maximum high water mark, the maximum high water mark is actually much higher than that. The mean high water mark shows a lot of this land as wetland. Now, if I superimpose that onto the actual subdivision, well, there's a subdivision there that's being proposed. And there's the wetland, which I've put on the same scale and I've tilted it slightly to make it match. And if I superimpose the two, you can see that the wetlands covers a significant proportion of the development area. Now, this is the wetlands at mean high tide, not at maximum high tide, which goes right around the edge here. Lou was told it's not wetland. It's not, of course it's not designated as wetland. It's a farm. And farmers don't allow their farm to be designated as wetland. So it doesn't, it's obvious. Now, as I said, surprise, surprise, the developer has brought the farm and now the farmer, and part of the agreement, there's a 2-year space where the development can keep it as a farm and even actually get, as far as I understand, the farmer to move the soil from up here, where it's quite steep, down to here to fill up the wetland. And of course, by that time, it won't be a wetland any longer. And it just really irks me that all these things happen pretty much on the sly from developers. So in conclusion, there's 3 points. The area of parks and reserves, Mapua and Ruby Bay, is way too small. The reserves are small and scattered to meet the needs of people, not the needs of nature. And council needs to do something about that in legislation. This little bright green area in the middle there is this new development site. Now, it would be absolutely fantastic if this little green strip here along Seaton Valley Stream joined up with this little bit up here, which I showed you earlier, of the Catherine Reserve, and there's stuff in here. And so you've got a decent corridor for plants and animals to migrate to and move to. And then the third thing is developers purchase land, but it's kept as a farm for a period of time to allow earthwork movement without required consent. Council needs to change that. And as soon as it's been bought by a developer, bells should be starting to ring and say, right, this is going to be developed land. Everyone knows it's going to be developed land. So let's treat it as that, not as a farm. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're right at time.
That's all right. I've said what I want to say.
Thank you. I just have one. Oh no, perhaps I won't. Yeah. So could you stop screen sharing? Yeah. Thank you. Ina has a question, I think, or is that from last time?
Oh, apologies. Thank you very much for your submission. It was very interesting to hear your details. Unfortunately, the hand was up for the last submitter, so my apologies, Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions? Very clear. Thanks, Bruno.
You've got my PowerPoint.
Yes, we have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we'll now move on to the next submitter, Steve Hayden. Steve, you're there. If you like to perhaps come forward, we'll take your submission now. So welcome and good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Lady Mayor and councillors. Thank you for letting me present to you. So my name's Steve Hayden. I live at 583 Tasmanby Road. And I want to talk specifically about the proposed expansion at T136 at Braben Road in Lower Moutere. My property borders the current proposal on the land that's proposed for development under that number. I'm also aware that Mr. Malcolm, who owns that land, which is subject of T136, has also made a proposal to extend the land. Currently, noted in the future development strategy to include some surrounding plots of land. It's in his submission number 31674 and 31674-1. And in his submission, I'm actually noted as an interested party, which I'll explain to you shortly. So I guess I have a rhetorical question, and my rhetorical question is, do I consider what's currently proposed in the future development strategy, or do I consider that which was proposed in Mr. Malcolm's extended proposal for the land to be developed? And the question is important to me. I bought my property around 5 or 6 years ago, and I chose to live where I do because I enjoy the countryside. I enjoy the cycle trail for both for cycling and for horse riding. I enjoy being away from urban areas, and I just enjoy all the things that living rurally gives you. I actually took a long time choosing where I live, and looked at a number of properties around the area, all with similar outlooks and similar characteristics. We intend this place, or when we bought this, we intended this to be our last place. And we're in the process of future-proofing where we live so that in future years, if we become infirm, we will be able to have care at our place rather than going to a home. And it's actually the place where we probably intended that we would head off to the funeral home. So I'm actually in a quandary at the moment. If the current future development strategy proposal is approved for Brayburn Road, then of course I'm an interested party, and I'll be advocating for things like sustainable homes, green access for the likes of cycleways, horse bridleways, kids to walk to school, and so on. And things like solar power and so on. If the expanded future development strategy for Brayburn Road proposal that Mr. Malcolm's made is adopted, then I'll have development happening all around me. I'll have constant traffic along Tasman View Road. My tranquility that I sought when I bought my property will go. And so I guess I may as well join in, hence me being an interested party in Mr. Malcolm's submission. I'm also concerned at my rates. If the smaller Brayburn Road proposal goes ahead, where I can maintain the kind of lifestyle that I'm currently building for myself, then I'm concerned that if my land is designated a development site or changes in its the ability of the number of houses you can build on it and so on, is my rates going to go up if I don't develop, because I will still have my piece of land and my house in the middle of it and so on. So I guess if that was going to happen, the current landowners, I would look for the current landowners who live around there, who bought under a different council strategy, to have their rates frozen in some kind of way. I'm also concerned about Tasman View Road. At the moment, there's only a few houses, but there's a few houses along there, and that's our main way in. And it's currently a non-maintained road. So as traffic increases, as time goes by, from four-wheel drive, cycleways, and I guess if we head towards Brayburn Road, we're going to have more traffic as that gets developed and so on before the eventual full development of the site. I'm actually having to maintain the road myself at the moment, and it costs me out of my own pocket each year. I did present on this in the long-term plan proposals earlier last year. So I'm kind of concerned about Tasman View Road as well. How will the cycle trail work if it becomes a major service road into a Brayburn Road development? So I've kind of got a lot of questions, and I'm not sure I've got any answers at the moment. So I wanted to kind of present them to you. I suppose in conclusion, whatever the proposal becomes or whatever gets approved, I strongly believe that we should adopt some principles for any new development, and it doesn't really matter whether it's Brayburn Road or any of the developments around in the Tasman Nelson area. I think there should be sorry, I've lost my way. I think we need to make sure that we have a sustainable homes, that we have cycleways, that we have horse riding bridleways, for want of another word. And I don't see many people advocating for the needs of the horse riding community, which is relatively large certainly in the Tasman area. And so I'm very keen to make that a strong priority in any of the development work that will go ahead under this future development strategy. I guess at the moment I'm sitting on the fence. I kind of don't know where my feelings lie, because it depends upon which Braeburn Road strategy gets adopted in the end. But whichever way, I certainly want to be involved and will be advocating for certain specific things, whatever the result. Thank you for listening to me. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your presentation. I will see if there's any questions. Councillor McGurk.
It's probably a quick question. I think you might have answered it stated before, but as it stands at the moment with T136, are you supportive or not supportive of it being included in the FDS?
I mean, I guess at the end of the day, it's kind of, I mean, I can see both sides, and again, I kind of sit on the fence a bit. You know, I can see the need from a community perspective to develop it, but being next to me, you know, I don't want it. So I guess if it was going to be confirmed, then I'd want to have some input into what was happening there. I guess if you ask me, would I support or not support, I'd not support.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? No, thank you, Steve. Thanks very much for your submission, and we'll move on to the next submitter.
Thank you.
And your points are noted. Thank you. So our next submitter is John Paul Pochin. Thank you.
Kia ora, everybody.
Yeah, good afternoon, John. Welcome. And so proceed with Paul. Proceed with your submission.
Well, I haven't spoken to a submission in a while, so I'm a little bit rusty. So, but I used to be coordinator of Bicycle Nelson Bays, which is our local advocacy cycle group. I always thought that getting more people cycling was going to save the world. I also then, we looked at the wider view of what a livable city was, and with Chris Ellison set up Vision Nelson some time back. I'm now a member of the Climate Forum, as our environmental crisis seems to have got far worse. So that's been my trajectory. Can I share screens?
Yes.
So this is where I grew up. It's Stone Terrace House, North Manchester. We came to Nelson about 27 years ago, originally backpacking, and Nelson was a scruffy little town then, but we're drawn to it, perhaps for where it was rather than what it was. It wasn't London, that was for sure, and that was a good thing. So I think I was lucky where I grew up. It was a modest house. It wasn't a shoebox in the middle of the road, but it was a great place to grow up. And it was compact. I'll just get to the next slide. So this is the backs of the houses, and this is all the backs were linked by lanes, and these lanes actually linked several terraces all over our little area, and it was a great place to play. It's changed a bit since then, and it is my brother's actually still living in the house. He actually leaves that today, so after all this time. But I'll get back to that and why in a second. So in comparison, New Zealand houses look very temporary. When we came here, I've heard them being described as wooden tents. And our first house in Hamilton was very much like that. Things have changed a little bit, but not much. But for me, New Zealand meant hope. It was somewhere to raise a family. And after living in London for 8 years, naively, I saw New Zealand as unspoiled. Now, a while back during a B&B submission, I was asked by a councillor whether I was anti-growth, and I pretty much avoided that question at the time. But my submission probably speaks to that quite a bit, in that I can't see the need for so much green field development. It's now 2022, and the latest IPCC report is even more damning than the last, and it's clear that New Zealand has some big environmental issues, and we're not doing enough to address them. A week ago, it was overshoot day, and we're now, from this point onwards, we're stealing from our children and our future generations. We can't continue to expand. In a while back, and the screen I'm showing now is the latest version of SimCity, mobile version you get on your phone, and it's a fun little game, but it sort of highlights this mentality that we still seem to have, that the focus of our towns and our cities is to grow. That's what you're supposed to do, isn't it? You just keep growing, you invite more people, you encourage more people to move there. And the irony isn't lost in the fact that I did move here, of course. But we take over more and more land, and the thing about this game is it's infinite. You don't have to explain where the resources come from. You don't have to worry about the mines that and the environmental damage that is done here. You can just keep building, and the land is infinite. You can just keep taking over, and it'll just tell you to make more roads. And here it's saying everybody loves parks, so you have to build a park even though you've just taken over all the land where the trees were. And where I grew up was fields and woods. So this is my concern, that actually we're just following this model of this computer game. We're still in this mentality that we can just grow infinitely. We can say, well, it's just one more development here, and we need to expand. We've got this need for houses, but there doesn't seem to be an end to this, and we're just eating the planet. So we need intensification, and I think that really needs to be the focus, but it can't be intensification at any cost. I worry about the way we've gone about developing our city so far, and these wall-off areas that we get. These are some our inner city developments that they're essentially taking little squares of the city, like in the simulation, where that are not connected to the outside, to the community. And this is one of the latest ones here. We're also building these big concrete slab buildings that are just an environmental legacy for our children. So incorporated into this intensification of the city, we really need good practices that are going to encourage developments that are environmentally good and also socially good. The reason why my brother's leaving the terrace houses we're in is that everybody tried to started grabbing their little patch of the shared space and putting fences up and fake grass down and deck chairs out, and it just, from this communal area, this mentality that we've all got to grab our little section of land and own it is destructive, I think. We need to look after the people of the city. So I've lost my place now. We need to focus on adapting our city and mitigation of, I live in the wood, and it worries me. We know that this is going to flood. We know other areas that are going to have a problem, and yet we didn't seem to be doing anything about these things. We're not looking after people in terms of transport. We've focused on car travel and commuting by car. And on Sunday, and Nelsast is running an event to try and highlight that and get justice for people that don't want to have to own a car to get around. Finally, I find this idea of competing towns is unhelpful in the context of, you know, if we want to develop our cities, and we even between Nelson and Richmond, we have this idea of competition, which I think has undermined a lot of things that we want to do. Our cities need to be working together. And I think that's one of the aims on this future development strategy. And I really hope that there's some big changes can come there, where our communities come together, not competing against for shops, for people to buy stuff or anything like that, but we actually start to develop a city that's good for everybody. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are you happy to answer questions if there is any?
Sure.
Okay. Councillor Deputy Mayor Ika.
Thank you. Thanks, JP, for that. So you will at least be happy this is a joint FDS. So
Yes,
that's a good step in the right direction, isn't it?
It is.
Just in your submission, you spoke or commented about public transport. You had regular, cheap and efficient. I'd also add accessible to it. I'm sure you would too.
Mm-hmm.
So are you aware of our public transport changes that are coming into effect 1 July 2023? And do you think that will, and the extensions out to Wakefield, you know, do you think some of that will help meet some of the problems you address, or?
Yeah, I've actually been thinking about that a little bit today. No, well, it will help, but we're playing catch up in a very big way. We are so far behind that we're never actually going to reach that point where we've actually got the transport system that unless we really make radical change, which is what we need to do. We need to make radical change. We can't just keep, you know, a lot of this stuff, you know, we talk about intensification and everything, but a lot of it is wording around, when you look at the, you know, you peel it back, we're just doing pretty much the same stuff as we've done before. But, you know, it's essentially business as usual. We do need radical change. You know, we're developing greenfield areas. You can't just add a few buses here and there and think that things are going to be different.
Yep. No, valid points. Thanks, JP.
Any further questions? Appears not. So thank you, John Paul.
Thank you very much.
We really appreciate your submission, and so we'll move on to the next submitter, who is Friends of the Mai Tai, Tom Kennedy.
You all right?
Kia ora, good afternoon.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Rachel.
Kia ora, Tom. Sorry, Mr. Chair, sorry to interrupt. I just have a question. I'm really sorry, Tom, but I'm looking at the screen and I can't see any Nelson City Council staff names. Are they all in the room today? I'm just conscious that this is a matter that is, Tom's, you know, this is a Nelson matter. Well, it's everybody's matter, but is the staff in the room today?
Rachel, that's a little awkward, but the answer is no.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, probably should have sent a text message. Apologies, Tom. Okay, well, we're here.
Hang on a minute. Susan's got a comment to make, Rachel.
Yeah, I've just checked, Mayor Rachel, that Nicole is online. She was intending to be here today, but...
she is. So apologies. I see her now. Kia ora, Nicole. That's great.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My apologies for that interruption, Tom. So when you're ready, if you'd like to speak to your submission and just highlight any points you wish to, or add any additional points. So,
thank you. I'm hoping that there'll be time for questions at the end. I presume you've all read the submission.
Yes, we have.
I commented to one of my colleagues this morning that democracy is hard work, but it's worth it, I think, the way the world situation is at the moment. And I just hope we have the courage to move forward more quickly. As the last speaker, JP, was pointing out, we need some bold action. Our group currently is focused on the impacts of pine forest harvesting, planting. At Broom Creek, we do water monitor quality measurements on a monthly basis, and we act as a guardian for our community for a river that's very precious. Regarding the future development strategy, our main concern is that the water quality and amenity values of the Maito River are improved. The recreational asset of the Maito Valley is reserved, and that the biodiversity in the area is fostered. We have various views coming from our group, so this is a joint effort and represents a consensus within the group, and we've decided that our focus is on the health of the river. I remember many years ago when I was visiting England and sitting in a cafe by a river that was very green with algae, and thinking, gosh, we're so lucky in New Zealand that we don't have that sort of river in New Zealand. Unfortunately, after about 15, 20 years from that visit, we have similar situations, even in Nelson. And our river is in a fragile state, and I'm not sure whether it could handle the urbanisation that is strategized for the Maito Valley. I'll focus on the FDS area, which is in the Maito Valley itself. My background is in geology as a water and soil scientist for the Conservation Department. I also have about 20 years experience as a hydrologist with TDC and Nelson City Council. So I've spent many, many years standing in rivers, measuring the water, watching what is happening to the water, and it's not improving. And I just have my doubts whether intense urbanisation in the Maitai, where the FDS has indicated it could be too much for the river to handle. I would just like to point out a catalyst report that was presented to the council in June 2017, updating the aquatic sites of significance. And in that report, I'm sure some of you will be familiar with it, there's a list of endangered and also fish species that are in a fragile state. They also identify the type of action that's required for various catchments. And the Maito River, they are recommending the main stem from the sea to the Maito Dam remain as sites of significance. The entire Maito North Branch, the entire Maito South Branch, the Brook mainstream and Maito confluence to the source, the entire Sharland stream and Packer catchment, and York mainstream. So already they've identified those areas as significant for the survival of our native species, which are in threat of extinction. Some of them are anyway, I know that. The other thing that I suppose I wanted to draw alert to is you'll have probably read it as well, the IPCC report on climate, and the scientists saying it's a final warning, and the UN Secretary General classified it as a code red for humanity. So we feel that the FDS, the current one, it hasn't met the mark. it is not adequate in so many aspects. It looks at, as the previous speaker said, it's like a computer game. You put a few buildings on the game and it looks nice and pretty, but there's so much more that needs to be considered. The amenity, the value, the historical value of the river. The use of the term greenfield in itself, when I think of the areas in the upper Maitai that border the area the FDS has identified, this is more than a greenfield. It's a catchment that flows into 3 or 4 major swimming holes that the thousands of Nelsonians have enjoyed over the years and still do enjoy. So I'm concerned at that type of terminology. It doesn't really describe the situation. And the other danger that we see is that once the FDS identifies an area that is potential for development or urbanization, it's sort of, you're locked into that paradigm where the next step is rural plan change, etc. And it's harder, it gets harder and harder, particularly for conservationists, to get some traction. One of the other concerns that we've emphasised is the need for a huge amount of infrastructure. The existing infrastructure in Milton Street and Niles Street is under stress at the moment, so that and when we've got big rain, our neighbours have raw sewage backing up through the stormwater system, sewage system. If you're putting up to 1,100 houses further up the system, there's some major infrastructural works, and that is all impacts on our footprint, green footprint. It's not the way forward. We support intensification in the already urbanized areas and improvement on the existing infrastructure. The other thing that I suppose I've noticed over the years is the inability of councils to really deal with our environmental problems. I think the will is there, but being under-resourced, they're trying the best they can, but because of under-resourcing and not strong enough legislation coming from central government, councils are finding it very difficult. We've got some examples in Nelson where developments have gone astray, the Mairi Stream, the existing development in the Waka, there's sediment entering the estuary, and I understand there may be a breach of consent there. So it's not working, and this is what our concern is, that if you have a large urbanized area developed in the Maitai, it's going to be very difficult to make sure that the river will stay healthy. I think I might just finish there, because if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them. So I just maybe finish on saying that Friends of the Maitai asked the council to adopt the same long-term vision as the early city planners who set aside such green spaces and strategically to limit future development in the Maitai Valley. Thank you.
Thank you. You're over time. Councillor McGurk has one quick question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, you, Doctor. Good to see you again. Thanks, Tom. Good to see you again, and thanks for the submission. I'm just wondering, just picking up on a comment you made about the intensification and around Milton and Niles Street. You would have seen in the future development study that we've that's an area for that area is sort of for intensification up to 4 to 6 stories, and so it's quite a bit more in there you're reasonably comfortable with that designation for the intensification in the more existing urban area?
Yeah, I think it will probably impact where I live, but I see it as the best way forward in terms of protecting existing amenities and green space, and just looking at examples overseas in cities where, and it can be done really well. I mean, there's some very good examples of very good intensified urbanisation that include green space, parks, etc. So it's people friendly.
Okay, good. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks very much for your submission and answering that question, and hope you have a good weekend, and we'll move on to the next submitter, which is Jaquetta Bill.
Good afternoon. You're hearing me and seeing me and everything. Yes, I see myself. Ahi ahi Māori ko Jaquetta Bell, toko ingoa. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. With me, I have my granddaughter, Anna Hay, because my concern over this future development strategy is not for myself, it is for our children and our future. I'm going to surprise you by starting with a quotation from 200 years ago, when British abolitionist William Wilberforce was campaigning against the slave trade. He said, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know." Abolition of slavery was the big issue of the time, as halting climate change is for our time. Supporters of both these issues put the greater good of humanity ahead of making changes to their own affluent lives. Both pit business as usual against sacrifice and risk to the economy. We know now how history judges slavery. How will the future judge us if we fail to halt climate change with our too big houses, cars and roads creeping outwards from cities, our polluted rivers and our failure to protect other species? This time, the issue is so huge that if we fail, there will be no judgment because there will be no future. The verdict from the scientists is in, and we can see climate change right here in Aotearoa. Wildfires in Tasman, a cyclone taking out the boathouse, floods in Westport and Tarawhiti, and now a drought in Southland. What is next? As William Wilberforce said, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know. In this context, I find the Tasman and Nelson Council's future development strategy both alarming and depressing. Imagine if these councils, along with others who've declared a climate emergency, decided to lobby government to say a future development strategy is inappropriate for our times. We've had enough of development. What we need is a future emergency strategy or even a future survival strategy. I've been involved in environmental groups since the 70s, most recently in the Brook Waimarama Sanctuary and the Friends of the Maitai. It's been evident for at least 50 years that we live on a planet with finite resources and that the consumer lifestyle of Western nations is not sustainable by any measure. I'm going to quote New Zealand poet Brian Turner speaking to a hearing on Meridian's proposal to build a wind farm on the Lammerlaw Range. Brian said, "As sentient creatures, we have duties for the term of our natural lives. Our core duty is to take responsibility for more than just increasing the material well-being of today's generations. As the Native Americans asserted, we don't inherit the earth from our parents, we borrow it from our children." Like most of you, I have lived in a blessed time. Even today, as war rages once more in Europe, most of us enjoy prosperity and peace in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I won't be here for the worst of the climate crisis, so why should I care? I care because of my 4 precious grandchildren and a wider concern for humanity, as well as for the other species which share this planet with us. I thank you people for taking on the fairly thankless task of local government leadership. I accept that you stood out of a genuine wish to make Nelson a better place. It baffles me that you believe this FDS will achieve that. Will housing in the Maitai Valley, a satellite village in Tasman, and the many other car and business-centric proposals genuinely make this a better place for our grandchildren to live? This is a strategy which reflects the failure of the RMA to protect the environment and the capture of council planning and decision-making by business interests, and particularly by those who profit from greenfield development, destroying natural areas and productive farmland to build houses designed for maximum profit. Too big for today's families and built with little or no regard for reducing carbon emissions in construction or end use. If the war in Ukraine does not wake us up to the need for food security in Aotearoa, we have a very rude shock coming. Although the FDS talks about encouraging urban intensification, it comes up with the paltry target of just 0.5% per annum. And yes, it probably will be as slow as that if all we get is buildings designed by developers motivated by profit. Nelson City Council lost a golden opportunity with the BET car park. A partnership with a forward-thinking developer could have seen a template for inner city living as now being built in Europe. Affordable apartments that foster a sense of community with shared play spaces, utility areas and gardens. Maybe there will be a next time when councils can show leadership and vision. Now to the Maitai Valley. I know Kaka Valley and PPCR 28 are outside the scope of the FDS, but I've heard other speakers talking on it, and given the failure of the 2019 FDS to identify the Maitai Valley as a development zone, Council must listen this time to the groundswell of public opinion against housing in this valued recreational area. The petition to keep the Maitai rural now has over 13,000 signatures. The FDS does not even acknowledge the recreational amenity of the Maitai Valley and the river, and does not mention or protect the swimming holes loved by many generations and highly used every summer, Wahi Takaro, Denny's Hole, Black Hole and Gurley's Hole. Development of housing in the Maitai Valley will inevitably result in a further decline in the water quality of the river, already adversely affected by pine harvesting and urbanisation. As we intensify in the city, it is vital that people have access to nature. The benefits to well-being are now recognised by the medical profession and by anyone who walks in the Maitai Valley, dog or no dog. Save the Maitai campaigners who have tried every avenue to get council to listen were told by people on the panel today that the RMA process would hear their concerns. This means ordinary, engaged and caring citizens are now fundraising for the hearing at an expected cost of $160,000. It is not too late for a courageous council to intervene. In conclusion, the Future Development Strategy 2022 is geared to growth. It covers a period of 30 years, ironically, the same timeframe as New Zealand's target of net zero emissions. In the 70s, I thought once people knew about climate change, they would change their ways. Today's media is full of coverage of climate disasters and of climate science. Many people are doing their best with less shopping and more composting, but government, councils, businesses and corporations are not moving nearly fast enough. Nelson styles itself as a smart little city where council has declared a climate emergency. If these words are to be anything other than greenwashing, FDS 22 needs a radical overhaul and a complete rethink of what a sustainable future really means. I return to poet Brian Turner. Our economy should be required to serve the natural environment, not the other way around. That's it. Any questions?
It appears not. So,
well, I've got a PS. I hope you can tell that I've put some time and effort into how best to sway your progress and growth views, but I have little optimism of succeeding. However, if you do only one thing, please appoint a working group to hasten intensification with really good imaginative green buildings. Tom and JP have already touched on this. I, for one, would eagerly move into a shared space for older people, freeing my 3-bedroom home for a family. And I'm only one member of the biggest demographic the Western world has ever seen, the much loathed baby boom generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your submission, and have a good weekend. Really appreciate that.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you. And we'll move on to our next submitter, who is Brenda Wright. Brenda, are you there, Samik?
Yes, I'm here.
Good afternoon and welcome.
Thank you.
If you would just like to talk to your submission, highlight any main points, and perhaps add any comments or additional comments you have, that'd be appreciated.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on Nelson and Tasman's future development strategy, the FDS. Ko Brenda Wright toko ingoa. I'd start by something that you all know. Nelson Tasman is famous for its pristine beaches, its moderate climate, and its proximity to 3 world-class national parks. It is also known as a great place for education, recreation, business, tourism, the arts, and families. The FDS proposes intensification in a number of towns and areas to accommodate predicted population growth. I am opposed to this for the Tahunanui area on a number of grounds. Firstly, the FDS consultation document does not specifically mention Tahunanui. However, several other documents do. None of these documents or information sources align, however. Some state development of 3 to 4 story buildings, others 5 to 6, and still others describe low intensification, which I take to mean 2 to 3 story buildings. Plus, one has to dig pretty deeply to see Tahunanui mentioned specifically in any of them. 3. This leads me to conclude that the council intends to pursue development by stealth. That is, deliberately leaves out key mention in the FDS of the intensification of Tahunanui and disguises its intentions in a vague and generalist narrative. While I am not opposed to intensification per se, I am strongly opposed to intensification that involves 5 to 6 story buildings on land that is currently housing families, retired people who have lived in the area all their lives, business owners, professionals, and many people in rental and supported accommodation. 5. Tahunanui is likely to be subject to serious liquefaction in the event of an earthquake. Multi-story apartments are unwise and potentially unsafe in this context. 6. Traffic is already a significant issue along Tahunanui Drive and Rocks Road. Proposed methods to alleviate congestion, including lanes dedicated to cars with more than one passenger, are poorly thought out and do not address the issue long term. Adding multi-story buildings and significantly more residents and their cars to the mix will exacerbate existing traffic issues. 7. My understanding is that developers of multi-story buildings will no longer have to provide car parks for residents. The FDS makes no mention of the impact on the area of hundreds of additional residents trying to park their cars in the streets. In summer, Tahunanui beach car parks and streets are already full of cars driving, parking, and turning. Adding more creates significant safety risks for other drivers, cyclists, and pedestrians. 8. The FDS does not, as far as I am aware, specifically reference Te Manatu Waka, the Ministry of Transport's Accessible Streets Strategy. This strategy proposes 15 actions as part of its initial Action to Zero strategy. These actions are designed to improve safety for footpath users, encourage active models of transport, and support the creation of more livable cities and towns. Any intensification in Te Hunanui needs to specifically reference and integrate the accessible streets strategy. Importantly, resource consent applications must include how developers will address the strategy in real terms, and that they be held to account if they do not. I cannot see this in the FDS. Related to this is my 9th point. I am appalled that the developers of the recently completed 5-story apartment block fronting the park and foreshore in Te Hunanui were given consent without having to notify or consult with residents. Undoubtedly, this apartment block will be used as a precedent for further development. It is insulting to fellow residents and ratepayers of Te Hunanui who need to have faith in the integrity of council processes. This faith is being tested. Apartments do not inspire or create community connectedness. 10, I object on the grounds that Te Hunanui is home to a very diverse community. The FDS makes no mention of where the hundreds of displaced people will go with the development of huge apartment blocks. They certainly won't be going into apartments that cost upwards of 800,000 K. 11, this is therefore a socially inequitable proposal for Te Hunanui and does not respect the housing needs of the people who actually live here now, including those who need affordable housing. 12, the intensification proposed in the FDS as it relates to Te Hunanui is also at odds, it seems, with much of the government's policy statement on housing and urban development, which includes that, 1, more, not fewer, affordable and accessible houses are built. 2, that buildings are resilient, including to natural disasters, such as earthquakes. 3, ensures that homelessness is prevented where possible. 4, Mahi Ka Ora, the Māori housing strategy, has to be enabled to deliver the best housing and urban outcomes for whānau Māori. How do 6-story pricey apartments do this? 5, the policy statement reestablishes housing as a home rather than a commercial asset. Apartments are for developers by developers for commercial gain. 6, the policy statement aims to reduce emissions and support communities to adapt to climate change. More cars on the road, really? In summary, I object to the intensification proposed in the FDS for Te Hunanui that would allow multi-storey buildings of 4 stories and above. And I urge the council to adopt a moratorium on height, preventing buildings higher than 3 stories. There are plenty of examples of moratoria that have still enabled intensification, but not wrecked the livability, affordability, and attractiveness of a town or city. Just look at Byron Bay, New South Wales, or Boulder, Colorado. Show ratepayers that you care about how our city will look and feel in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have some questions. You're happy to answer, I take it?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Councillor McGurk.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Brenda, for your submission. Very, very comprehensive. I understand the points you're making. Amongst the documents you've read, have you seen the proposed regional public transport plan for Nelson Tasman?
Briefly. I'm not intimately familiar with it. I glanced over some documents as I was preparing my thoughts for this submission.
Oh, right, yeah. Okay, no, that's fine.
Any further questions? I know that brings us to the end. Brenda, thank you very much for your submission and taking the time to make that and coming and speak to us today. Really appreciate that. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate that too.
Okay, thanks. And we'll move on to, oh no, I think it's a tea break. But you want to keep going. So with that, to the people on Zoom, we will break for tea now and resume at 3:35. Sorry? 3:25. Yep. So yeah, that's 3:25. We will come back and continue with the hearing.
Yeah, but it's 3:06.
Yeah. Good afternoon and welcome back, everyone. Just for those that have joined us since the tea break, I'll just run through that. We'll ask you as on the schedule to speak to your submissions. If you can, we have read them, but if you, well, particularly read the ones that are being presented today, we may not have read all of the submissions yet. We'll just ask you to speak to your submission, highlight any main points you want to highlight and any additional information you may want to add. Barry or Susan will ring a bell at 8 minutes to give you a little warning, and at 10 minutes that'll be the final bell. So if you'd like to just leave some time, particularly after the 8 minutes, for questions, that would be appreciated. Without any further ado, I think we'll move to our next submitter, who is Peter Taylor. Peter, are you on Zoom there with us?
Kia ora, yes. Can you just confirm that you can hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. So good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon to you. Thank you for this. Look, I'm going to be fairly brief. I just want to say that I completely support all moves in the draft FDS towards intensification. I don't support the extensive greenfield development that has been proffered in the FDS. I think it's not compatible with climate change objectives. I think you're caught in between a rock and a hard place, but as Lindsay Wood will tell you, that building greenfield developments, the materials, the transporting costs, the roading issues, the transport issues that give rise from greenfield developments are not compatible with the climate change objectives of the country, and certainly not compatible with the Mayor's recent climate emergency call. So I support all moves to intensification. I think it would be great if you could extend that and find some way to incentivise people who own land in inner city Nelson and Stoke and Richmond. There are plenty of areas that are pretty immediately visible where we can put some buildings. I myself grew up in some estate house in Christchurch. There was one of 4 blocks. They were 2 stories high. Everybody had a tiny backyard, and people were pretty happy with that at the time. I'd also like to request that you take out Kaka Valley from the future development strategy. I think democratic processes have been running. 13,000 people have told the Nelson City Council they don't want greenfields developments in the city in the Maitai Valley. That should be loud and clear. I think if you fail to move on that one at this opportunity, you're really behaving contemptuously towards a lot of people who hold that development is important for housing, but also so is recreational areas and green spaces for people to exercise in. So it would be compatible if you were to keep the Maitai relatively undeveloped, and if we were to go for an intensification model over the next 20 or 30 years, you would be able to confidently say there were green space fairly close to the city for people who had agreed to live in more intensive housing areas. So of course, if you've been to Europe, you would have seen many towns in Europe are incredibly attractive. They have 3- and 4-story high housing units. Millions of people live in them. They build incredibly well. And I think if the council, if your politicians were really to throw your weight behind this, I think you could do something fantastic for Nelson. It would be supportive of climate change objectives, and it would also help with keeping some green space. So the current plan is, I think the current draft is fairly flawed. You're stretching out the city more or less from Todd's Valley right out to Mapua. You're promoting green space areas through additional villages. And by doing that, you are committing enormous debt and enormous traffic problems to future generations, when there's a much better solution that you could be looking at this very moment through working politically and with your regulations to make it easier for people in the inner city to build up, for example. And as I said, there's certainly plenty of opportunities to do that. So to summarise, support intensification, support the council incentivising inner city dwellers to build up. Don't support the degree of greenfield developments that you have in the draft FDS on the basis of climate change impacts and potential traffic problems in the future, and would certainly like to request that you take out Kaka Valley from the future development strategy. We need that green space, and thousands of people have actually asked for that, and I think you have a democratic obligation to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for your submission. I will see if there are any questions. Deputy Mayor.
Kia ora, Peter.
Look,
just a question, and look, feel free to say it's outside of your scope or expertise. Just, you know, musing on intensification, of course, and, you know, we've been presented with a range of views, and one thing that, you know, comes across is the cost of, you know, multi-storey dwellings. Now, you know, and you mentioned, you know, the sort of the life costs and the greenhouse gas costs of greenfield development. Now, we know that it's not necessarily about the council costs. You know, some people say, well, if you know, discount development contributions, you'll get, you know, cheaper outcomes. You know, I know from my time here on Tasman, there were times where there were even no DCs, and of course the cost of what the developer sold was zero cheaper. You know, it did not reflect that they didn't pay DCs at all. So how do you make intensified dwellings affordable as well without them being social, you know? So intensified dwelling is for, you know, not just about social housing or public housing. And you know,
well, I think that's a multifaceted, you know, there's no single answer to those things. And there is a question of where do the costs fall, and they're going to fall all over the place. So if you go for massive greenfields development, the costs of infrastructure are inevitably going to fall on ratepayers and taxpayers. The cost of putting pipes and widening roads and everything up to the Maitai, for example, is going to be absolutely massive. And that's going to be a burden for ratepayers as well as the developers. If the developers have a higher share, of course, it's going to push the price of houses up in there. I think the question is more, where can the council be effective? And I think if you just look around your existing infrastructure, for example, I know in the Wood, you know, a few years ago, there was massive upgrades to the drainage system in the Wood. And if you can optimize existing infrastructure like roads and drainage system and electricity supplies, then you're minimizing the costs. If the council, and that's where you can be effective as a council, if you can give some incentive through reducing consent costs to developers who might come in with proposals to build 3 or 4 unit buildings, then you're incentivizing them. So I think it's more to do with where can you be effective, and where do you choose to make decisions that might determine where some of the costs fall. You can't control developers, you can't control the cost of building materials. There are limited areas you can go, and those areas can increase costs on ratepayers, or they can decrease them, and they might make it more efficient for developers to build in inner city areas. So I think the only area I think you can go with inner city development is to look at the regulations that make it difficult, to look at the costs of converting commercial land in inner city areas to residential land, and see if it's possible to reduce some of those costs to make it easier for the developers. But you know, when you look around at some of the areas on St Vincent Street and Rutherford Street that are sort of glorified vacant lots where there's car parking, there's enormous potential for buildings in town if we could get it zoned residential. You might recall that some years ago, people were quite opposed to the apartments around by the port, but in fact, in some, you could say they're an excellent development. Those buildings that are on the side of the road, they're housing quite a number of people, and I think there are many areas where that could be looked at again. So I don't think you should be daunted by the cost. The cost is going to fall in all sorts of places, and that has to be determined, and you can just determine where you can minimize the costs for people to incentivize the strategy which I'm promoting to you to support the intensification strategy.
Thank you. Yes, no, I was thinking just more about the affordability for people to get into the houses rather than necessarily the affordability for council.
Well, it's probably going to be in terms of affordable housing. As I say, I grew up in a state house, and I'm very grateful for that. I grew up to 19 years of age, and I'm immensely grateful that the State Housing Corporation was able to provide that. And on the news today, I heard there was collaboration between Kāinga Ora and Te Puni Kukuri and 2 or 3 other agents to build some affordable housing. And I think that sort of collaboration is probably the way forward for the country, where groups collaborate and identify land and see what can be done there.
Thank you.
Thank you. It appears there are no further questions, Peter, so really appreciate you taking the time to make your submission and come and speak to us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciated.
And we'll move on to, have a good weekend, and we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Heather Wallace. Heather, I think you're there.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
That's probably not so bad. Okay, thank you. While Friends of Golden Bay are alarmed at the sort of development proposed for Golden Bay, and as the previous speaker said, we spread around a lot. There's a lot of rural residential proposed for Golden Bay, and that will take up a lot of good productive land, and I don't think it's going to be solving the sort of problems that we've got for housing. So we'd like to see much more intensification as well of what we've already got. However, really, we would like to talk to the Keegan Road proposal, which is in in Golden Bay. Our estuaries are really important, and they're important for the earth. I mean, they sequester a lot of carbon, they host species that are very vulnerable, and looking at the bigger picture, they are very important ecosystems. Now, Keegan Road is right above the Onahout estuary, which is classified in the Waimea Inlet to Kaharangi Point habitat mapping assessment as ecological value is high. It's also of national significance in the Melville and Schuchard report on birds. So those areas actually need a lot of peace, and the Onahout estuary is quite peaceful. It's not developed around it, and neither should it be. It is also an outstanding natural landscape, and Friends of Golden Bay participated in that process for quite a few years, even though it's still not gazetted. Really, to compromise it before it can even be gazetted or not gazetted is not good. This estuary, and I've listed all the species that are there in our submission. They need room to move these species. A lot of them are edge nesting species, and as sea level rise occurs, then they're going to have to move inland. They're very vulnerable. They're vulnerable to cats, to rats, the sort of things that housing brings with them. So I think this is totally not appropriate. Then, of course, you've got the drainage. The land that's proposed all drains towards the estuary. Now, the technical report says that 25% of the land is for roading in these developments. Well, that's roads, that's building platforms, that's huge runoff into the estuary. And estuaries cannot tolerate this. This is a big estuary, and it's flat. It doesn't flush. Estuaries don't flush. So we're kind of astonished that it would be classified for development. But we were also even more astonished to hear that it was at the request of the owners. I find that a very odd planning tool, that someone says they want it. There's a lot of reason they may well want it. However, I don't think that should be a planning tool. I think planning tools ought to be more geographical. And in the bigger picture, just because we demand something, it doesn't need to be supplied. Maybe we'd all like to go to the moon, but you know, we're sitting here trashing this planet. Maybe we'll have to. But yeah, it seems to be a bit sad. So we've got past. I hope planners have got past with their wonderful words and high sounding ideals from the FDS when we read about it. I hope we've got past thinking about we have to supply what everybody wants, because of course we all want our beautiful 10-acre blocks and nice roads and paddocks we can run around in our ride-on mowers. So that's all I've got to say about that. Just a plea to take Keegan Road out.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, happy to answer questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Councillor Ogilvy's first.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Thanks for your submission. I'm not as au fait with the Hayata area as I ought to be. In your submission, are you referring only to the Keegan Road Onahau Estuary part, or are you referring to the whole development proposal for Rangi Hayata?
Well, it is just down Keegan Road. There's another one on the opposite side of
Exactly,
the main
yes.
road.
That's
Yeah, not that one, no. That's probably relative, maybe appropriate, but the Keegan Road one is
right.
It actually isn't even a road, it's a dirt track going to a farm.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Heather. That's all I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Any further questions? No, it appears that's the only question, Heather. So thank you for your submission.
Thank you.
We heard it loud and clear. Hope you have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And we'll move on to our next submitter, who is Matthew Hay. Welcome, Matthew.
Hi there. Kia ora, Mayor, councillors, kia ora whakatū. I'm Matthew Hay, co-director of Fine Line Architecture. We're based here in Nelson. I think it's great that we've got this FDS, that it's been put together, but I'm quite concerned that the FDS hasn't had any visionary leadership given by council to deliver the future that we want and need for Nelson. Upon a close reading of the FDS, it feels a lot like business as usual. In the main, I agree with the stated outcomes set out in the FDS. But again, in close reading, these lead me to consider that the proposed outcomes are actually objectives. In my opinion, we need a more deliverable vision that establishes a framework that the future development can follow that would ensure that these objectives actually do become the outcomes that we want. I understand that it's a difficult line between public commercial development and council oversight. However, with the imminent council climate emergency that we're in the midst of, there's no time to waste, and we need to be bold and we need to act confidently. In my mind, that needs to be a vision-based development and include potentially a Nelson Tasman urban design agency, which could take a lead in graphically presenting a vision of the future of Nelson that developers could then actively participate within. The building industry, as we all know, is responsible for approximately 20% of national greenhouse gas emissions. And thus we have to look at how we can reduce the embodied carbon consumption during life of the building, as well as efficiently deal with the end of life of buildings. One key way of reducing the carbon impact of buildings is to look at quality intensification of the built environment. The key aspects of this would include smaller footprints to building, less need for infrastructure, access to amenities, including cycling and walking. The notion of a 20-minute city could be adopted, where people can walk or cycle to all the amenities they need within a 20-minute radius. We can maintain a moderate human scale for intensification. Intensification doesn't need to be scary. 3, 4, 5-story developments within the Nelson Tasman region, strategically positioned in conjunction with green space, can vastly improve the occupancy density of a place without negatively affecting the culture Change is hard to do, but change doesn't need to be seen as a negative. And given the right vision, public support can be gained. Intensification can also reduce cost in housing, which is a key issue in the housing market. We need the density to occur where it's needed. The FDS offers us intensification in land use in areas like Mapua and Motueka, but the notion of intensification does not really apply when moving from rural land to single lot residential buildings. We need to ensure that the development occurs where suitable demand for employment occurs. One of the predictable outcomes of the FDS on close reading is actually more commuter traffic heading into and out of Nelson and Richmond on a daily basis. Now, I don't think this is intentional, but this is one of the key reasons that I believe the FDS should not be accepted in its current form. We must look closely at the local layout topography of the Nelson Tasman region with an understanding of how future hazards and development and create a clear long-term urban design vision for the future development of Nelson Tasman that doesn't include the large number of greenfield sites proposed in the region under the current FDS. We need to limit, if not end, the hunger developers have for the simple conversion of high-yield arable land into low-density housing. The reliance on this model, the reliance that this model has on car use and additional infrastructure is not sustainable, let alone will it not meet the net zero carbon vision that central government has laid out. It is time for us to look at the opportunities that council-led developments have opened up in other parts of the country and around the world. Development should nurture communities and have buy-in from iwi and communities rather than let the market control the future direction. The business as usual model has not changed our carbon consumption, even though there has been for some time the scientific information to say things are going badly wrong. Intensification using quality design guidelines that include notions of diversity, sustainability, carbon capture, and low energy consumption can easily be established if council is willing to adopt these. Passive House, Living Building Challenge, Green Star, and regenerative principles are all examples of guideline-based standards that are proving to deliver better quality housing with improved environmental impact and lower embodied carbon. Adding an element of well thought out urban design designation and potentially allocating zoning to the FDS and setting quality standards within these would be a big step towards changing what the FDS currently calls outcomes to having the actual capacity to deliver these outcomes. The FDS as it stands at the moment is only a set of feel-good objectives that doesn't really provide us the pathway to seeing these becoming actual outcomes. In summary, I would hope the council take time to revisit the current FDS and rework it to include graphically demonstrable urban design strategies that would call for increased intensification close to all town centres in the regions, creating the 20-minute city experience for as many people as possible. The new FDS would significantly reduce the ability of high-yield arable land to be converted into low-density single unit titles. I would implore the council to lead by example and become actively involved in high density developments and set standards for these developments beyond that of the current building code. With the current building crisis upon us, it is time to be bold and take control of our collective futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Appreciate that. I will see if there's any questions. Very clear as the comment around the room here. So no, that there is no questions for you. So we've got the message. Thank you very much for your submission, and we'll move on to the next submitter, who is Lindsay Wood. Good afternoon, Lindsay, and welcome.
Thank you very much, councillors, and wakatu, and kia ora to all of you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. I'm going to be reading from a statement. I don't have any slides to show you. I would like to basically endorse what the others have said. And I think probably if you've read my submission, you'll know I'm probably going to make them look like the good cop by the time I've finished. I'll do my best to keep to your 8-minute target. I might be just a little bit tight on that. So thanks for the chance to present. So that you know, I'm going to use the terms FDS for the Draft Future Development Strategy and NPS for the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. My challenge today is to leave in your hearts no doubt that it would be gravely irresponsible to allow this FDS to proceed in anything like its present form. It's deeply short on effective climate responses and contains features that are self-defeating and that exacerbate the climate crisis. I've run a climate strategy company for almost a decade. I engage full-time with climate issues, and I have the privilege of contact with climate experts in New Zealand and around the world. And I'm urging you to scrap this FDS and replace it with something truly worthy of the title Future Development Strategy. When the FDS documents landed, the shortcomings on climate were so monumental that I couldn't grasp how, especially in a city with a declared climate emergency, they could even be put out for consultation. How could a proposal supposedly planning a robust future show so little regard for the scientific and political imperatives to be climate responsible? The resilience submission was critical of many facets of the FDS, and I wish to amplify just on one, at least, to illustrate why the FDS is so unfit for purpose. I've chosen to speak on our energy future, but I could similarly have discussed the built environment, climate mitigation, urban intensification, a just transition, or a whole lot more. While the FDS claims it is responsive to climate issues, it is devoid of a single strategy with the promise of actually being effective in that area. I could talk a little bit to the intensification thing if you wish. Decarbonizing our economy is a paramount yet daunting necessity, and electrifying transport and industry with renewable electricity is pivotal, albeit it's hugely challenging. At the risk of oversimplifying a complex issue, almost all aspects of our future well-being will be shaped by how well we transition to low emissions energy sources. And central to that is electrifying our economy from renewable generation. The logistics of that are formidable to the point of being potentially unattainable. We must plan for at least an energy challenged future and likely a seriously energy constrained one. We might well be unable to access the energy needed to support the economy and the lifestyles we are used to. By coincidence, just this morning in my inbox, after I'd written what I've just said, was a post by UK energy economist Tim Morgan. He stresses, and I quote, "Transition to renewable energy sources, though imperative, cannot replicate the economic characteristics of fossil fuels." That is saying we must expect and plan to take a serious hit on our energy usage. So in that context, what of the FDS? It contains no discussion whatsoever of energy or electricity, even though they are fundamental to our future well-being, and that's what the FDS is meant to be addressing. Page 10 of the technical document notes that the NPS requires us to consider, and I quote, every other national policy statement. It then references 3, but at the footnote on the very same page, it says, note the other NPS, the National Policy Statement for Renewable Electricity Generation, is not considered to have any particular relevance to this draft FDS and has not informed the preparation of the draft. Section 2.2 of the FDS itself affirms this cherry-picking approach by inserting the qualifier relevant into the NPS statement, as in every other relevant national policy statement. I hope you've got that. Electrifying our economy with renewable electricity is pivotal to our future. The NPS requires the FDS to consider every other national policy statement, and yet the FDS chooses not to consider every other national policy statement, cherry picking what it looks like and even suggesting the generation of renewable electricity is of negligible relevance. Additionally, it even dilutes the wording of the NPS to seemingly validate that enfeebled approach. Deliberately ignoring such a fundamental issue is like a transport planner deliberately ignoring that we drive on the left, or a health official deliberately ignoring hygiene. That is the bizarre degree of anomaly you would be endorsing if you failed to require a major rethink of this FDS. Here's what the preamble says to the National Policy Statement on Renewable Electricity Generation. The contribution of renewable electricity generation, regardless of scale, towards addressing the effects of climate change plays a vital role in the well-being of New Zealand, its people, and the environment. Sections E and F also require regional planning to address renewable electricity, including small and community scale renewable electricity generation. So we find the FDS has consciously chosen to disregard a mandatory document on a matter playing a vital role, quoting, in the well-being of New Zealand, its people, and the environment. The FDS is fundamentally flawed in the way it fails to address energy generally and renewable electricity in particular. As a result, it perceives our future in a grossly distorted way and proposes solutions to the wrong problems. Much the same could be said about many other key aspects of the FDS. Hasn't a single person from the two entire councils raised the alarm on this? Hasn't one of the elected members or myriad officers or many consultants sounded an alarm that this FDS is riddled with weaknesses in regard to climate? Or if someone did, why has our system so failed to properly register that alarm? We must also ask why the quality assurance on such a crucial strategy depends on a lottery. It depends on citizens like me happening across it, identifying its deep flaws, and fronting up to you and saying, throw it out and start over. And please don't insult your communities by trying to lay this at the feet of the NPS and claiming the draft strategy is merely a response to that policy. Such a claim might have a trace of credibility were the FDS prefaced with an apology to the people of Titaui who that it was prevented from being climate responsible by the NPS. There's no such apology. But for this FDS, the only climate responsible course of action is to demand a major rethink. This is a time for you to dig deep and find the courage to demand just that. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks very much for your submission. We'll have some time for questions if there are any. Do we have any? Very extensive submission, Lindsay. There are no questions, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Appreciate. Oh, hang on, Councillor McGee.
Yeah, thanks. Lindsay, you have those speaking notes. Would they be able to be made available to us?
Hello, Brian. Yes, I have got a PDF to send in. I think the email request was said that, and I'll send them in.
Got it, yeah, because I've got a hard copy of the of your draft submissions with the nine points that you've raised.
I'm sorry. You saying something? You want a copy of what I've just read out, or are you looking for something?
No, just a copy of what you've read out.
Okay, yep. I'll email that in. Do you want a personal copy, Brian, or would you like me to email it just to the council?
Yeah, I think if you email it to the council so we can all have a copy, Lindsay, would be appreciated.
Certainly do that. Thank you. Kia ora, have a good weekend.
Kia ora.
Good luck finishing this marathon.
Thank you. And we'll move on to our next submitter, who is David R. Yeah, right. David, are you there? Yes, you are. Good afternoon and welcome.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Loud and clear.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your opportunity to speak to you today. I know you've been very busy in the last few days and I appreciate your time. In these presentations, many people have called for a rethink of this FDS. They're right. It makes no effort to deal with the major issues of our time. It tries to follow a business as usual approach pathway when the near future in the next 10, 30 and 100 years is going to be nothing like usual. As a result, it completely misses its own intended target, namely, how do we prepare for the future? Question 40 asked, is there anything you think we have missed? In my submission, I listed 5 things, but the one-page summary of my submission that appeared in the FDS files didn't mention any of them. So I'm going to briefly summarize them here to keep us all on the same page. 1, there is no meaningful discussion of how we deal with growth in the future. The FDS talks about medium growth and high growth and then focuses on high growth without really bringing any growth choices front and center. As a result, you've left out the first and most important part of the discussion. At the moment, the FDS proposes to allow for growth up to about 2% per annum, which would see the population of our towns and cities double every 35 years. That is a big mistake. Most of that increase would come from overseas because our own population increase is very low. The world population increase is about 1% per annum and falling. We need to focus on limited medium growth in this 30-year timeframe, while we rebuild our towns and cities as intensified communities fit for this century. We know that urban intensification will handle that degree of limited growth, and it will give us much better towns and cities. 2, there is no meaningful discussion about how we deal with climate change. This leads to extremely shallow statements like the FDS plans for growth that supports a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, as though that takes care of the problem. I don't think we have looked at, and I don't think you have acknowledged, the magnitude of the challenge that climate change represents. And this is leading you to treat it as another thing that has to be thought about. And when you've thought about it, you can return to business as usual. No, you can't. Climate change is a consequence, one of many, of us expanding as fast as we can to do anything we feel like. Most of that has been powered by fossil fuels. We have reached the point now where that endless, thoughtless expansion is coming to an end, and that will produce a complete change in the way that we live. If we work that through well, the result may well be a much better society than the one that we have now. But it won't be the same, and we need to talk about that and work it through at that level. Nelson City Council hasn't even got a strategic climate plan yet, and despite that is talking about growth as though the two fit together. They don't. Number 3, the lack of numbers. The draft FDS says things like the Zero Carbon Act 2019 sets targets to reduce New Zealand's greenhouse gas net emissions to 0 by 2050, and then makes almost no attempt to work out how that is going to be carried out, despite the fact that it's almost exactly the same time period as the FDS. Early FDS webinars contained statements like, we don't need to consider the Zero Carbon Act in the FDS. Shallow, compartmentalized thinking. One example of the lack of numbers for you. Halving our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, one of many targets that the world needs to meet, will require the reduction in emissions of about 7.5% a year, every year, between now and 2030. There are many more targets beyond that to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Despite all this, the FDS simply makes broad, sweeping, qualitative statements as though numbers and detail are someone else's problem. They're not. They're ours. Number 4, The planet isn't concerned about accounting issues like average emissions per person. It's only concerned about the total emissions entering the atmosphere. If our population is increasing, every target is more difficult to reach. That's one aspect of what we mean by finite planet. That's where we are now, trying to learn how to be sustainable. I don't mean until the next quarter or until the next council triennium. I mean thousands of years into the future. New thinking, energy descent, circular economies, limits. Number 5, 2 specific land use issues that should be included in any plan that is trying to cover the next 30 years, but which aren't. The first issue is where we are going to put Nelson Airport in the future. A large amount of sea level rise is now inevitable as a result of emissions that we've already created, and we are continuing to create more emissions. As a result, we will either need to protect the existing Nelson Airport site strongly in the future, or we'll need to move the airport. That will have major implications for suitable land, both for the airport itself and for related land use and services. That should be considered now so that that move is possible if and when necessary. The second issue is flooding in Nelson City. The FDS barely mentions risks from sea level rise and river flooding, bypassing any significant discussion of either. Again, somebody else's problem. No discussion about civil engineering changes that may be needed to cope with stronger and more frequent storm events, including a retention dam in the Maitai Valley. All of these major land use issues should be considered and discussed with our community. Until we've thought about all these things and had a long community discussion, this FDS is missing some very large pieces. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, David. Do we have any questions? No, I think you've made your points very clear there, David. So I appreciate the making the submission this afternoon. Thank you very much. And
Thank you,
we will move on to the next speaker, which is Suzanne O'Rourke for Fonterra, and speaking with Rob Stevenson. Rob, you're there? Yep.
Afternoon, guys.
Right. Suzanne with you or coming? Or?
She's just appearing, I think.
Right. I hopefully am about to appear.
Yes, yes, you have, and we can hear you both loud and clear.
Perfect.
Great. Afternoon.
So, yes, good afternoon and welcome. So if you'd like to proceed with your submission, that would be appreciated.
Thank you. I will do. I'll just firstly ask you to introduce yourself, Rob, and then I will do that and talk further.
Yep. So my name's Rob Stevens. Really pleased to be here today. My role is local government engagement for the South Island. So looking forward to this session. Thank you.
Thanks. My name's Suzanne O'Rourke. I'm the National Policy Manager for Fonterra. So I look after manufacturing interests across our 30 sites in relation to regional and local policy and planning processes. So I'll just highlight some key points from our submission. Broadly speaking, we support the FDS. We support the direction and certainty it gives to councils, infrastructure providers, developers and landowners as to where future growth may occur. Our interest relates to our 2 manufacturing sites. So we have the Brightwater site, which is, just looking at my notes as I do this, and my technology is moving very slowly, apologies. So our Brightwater site is located on Factory Road, just southeast State Highway 6 and south of the Wairoa River. So this site's been operating since 1902 and it processes at peak production up to 250 litres of milk per day. And our other interest is the Takaka site, which is located obviously just east of the Takaka township, again been operating since 1902 and processes about 550,000 litres of milk at peak production. So we consider the outcomes sought in the FDS are generally appropriate. However, we recognise that future potential land use should not occur alongside activities which are incompatible, such as residential areas alongside industrial land use. So on that basis, we had sought a couple of additions to the outcomes in the FDS. So those are outcomes 3 and 5. And those are referenced in page 4 and 5 of our submission. In that we were seeking additional wording that reflected activities developing such as housing and residential business land should happen in locations that avoid existing incompatible activities. So we had underlined some additional wording we were looking to have added to those 2 outcomes. Just going more specifically to the 2 sites, so Brightwater has industrial zoning where our site is, and the proposal seeks to include further industrial zoned land near to that site. We support that. We support the development of activities which are compatible with existing land uses being industrial. And probably the more relevant part of our submission relates to the Takaka site. So currently we have the factory situated in Takaka, and we have a fairly sizable buffer of land to the west and south and north that just wraps around that site. So the FDS identifies an area as T139 that could be redeveloped for residential purposes. And it identifies that this area could accommodate up to 50 lots based on 500 square metre area. So again, obviously we support the intent of further residential development, just recognising there that there is the potential for residential area close to industrial type activities or buffer land to have adverse effects such as reverse sensitivity. So just looking to acknowledge that issue, and again, looking to make an addition to section 10.1 to include some wording that refers to the need to avoid existing incompatible activities. And also just my last point there relates to servicing. So Fonterra uses part of that buffer land for their stormwater disposal. And so again, just wanting to ensure that if further residential land is developed near to that site, that consideration is given to where that stormwater would be disposed of, and that it doesn't compromise that currently.
Whoops, I think you've frozen, Suzanne. Can you hear us?
Yeah,
well, can you? Yeah.
She's certainly frozen. So really, I think those are the sort of main issues that Suzanne's outlined. Want to acknowledge and thanks for the opportunity to make this submission on the draft FDS. And really, I think those are the sort of main points that we wanted to raise.
Thank you. Are you happy to answer questions? And hopefully Suzanne might come back. Or
I will try my best.
Thank you. Councillor McGurk.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, a very clear submission that you've made in both your written and your verbal submission. Something to the side, probably 2 questions. One is, are the likely size of the sites at both Takaka and Brightwater likely to remain roughly the same size they are now in terms of?
I think probably Suzanne is better to answer that, but I think Suzanne's better to answer that, sorry.
Fine, that's a good question.
Okay.
And the next one, completely unrelated, is the size of your workforce at both sites. Is that?
Yep.
Can you,
So
The
Whitewater has about 42 people.
Yep.
And Takaka has about 60.
Thank you. I'll just see if Suzanne's come back. Are you able to hear us now, Suzanne? He is not. No, that's a shame. Any other questions? Yeah, perhaps in response to Councillor McGurk's first question, perhaps you could email a response to us.
Will do.
That'll be appreciated. Thank you.
Happy to.
Yeah, so good afternoon and have a good weekend, both of you. Thank you for that. Cheers. And we'll move on to Trevor Chang.
Yes, good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to express my views here. My name is Trevor Chang. I've lived in Te Hunanui Drive for more than 70 years, and I'll answer questions according to conditions of the Zoom session at the end of the presentation and within the 10-minute period allocated to me.
That'll be fine, thank you.
I have seen, applauded, and been appalled by many local and national decisions made regarding this area, often without full in-depth discussion and or consultation with all affected parties. In some cases, decisions have been arrived at even before consultation process has begun. Now, on the feedback side, I agree that on item 3, I agree that new housing is of vital importance and needs to be prioritised, especially for the sake of young families, first homeowners, those bound to a lifetime of renting, and the less privileged who are unable to find accommodation. I then move to item 6, where I have no problem with growth. However, what has been suggested for Te Hunanui, first by transit appearing to justify their existence by prioritising what is considered best for the area, by removing all on-street parking, the destructive effect of this on the commercial retailing centre, medical and associated services of the village arise from transit ignoring previous consultation. Second, the high-density residential plan for Te Huna does not appear to comply with the inundation plan, which I think was mentioned by one of the earlier speakers from about 3 or 4 years ago. And that was that the entire western side of Te Hunanui and Annesbrook Drives, from south of KFC to the airport, will at some stage be subject to some tidal effect. Therefore, foundations would be required to be elevated above ground level. This would in fact eliminate the possibility of any new commercial enterprises being constructed with enterprises at footpath level, thus causing inconvenience to the elderly, the infirmed and young parents. The Hunanui Drive customers would be required to park on side roads just to make the smallest of purchases. As for item 10, the Tasman district, especially around Richmond, is a sprawling mass of 7 to 1,000 metre properties, which in time will stifle the horticultural and agricultural land in the area. High density housing would have lessened stress on farming land and later allowed for food production to feed the 1,000 tongue-in-cheek who would occupy the Huna's high density housing estates. Item 12, since sunlight and views are not a priority and on-site parking is no longer compulsory for tenants and residents, I question whether tenants and residents will park their vehicles. I have used rudimentary tools to ascertain the total footprint envisaged for both 3- and 6-storey areas. I've allowed for a 20% reduction in the footprint for service areas and possible atria. The number of 120 square metre units would equate to a hypothetical 37,000 units. Item 14. The southern corridor is understood to be no more than a pipe dream. However, Transit had purchased all but a couple of properties for this project and would be capitalising on rental income. An opportunity exists for the government to make this area available for high density, low value housing if their social consciences allow. The area is within walking distance of the CBD. The Victory area could support further commercial growth, and cycling and minibuses could provide services which would further reduce the use of private vehicles. I feel that developers would not entertain the suggestion that the selling price of these units would be well below their expectations. There is, however, the possibility of another 11,000 units of 120 square metres in 6-storey blocks to be accommodated in this area for some enterprising developers. Item 18. Concern regarding Brightwater that's already having engineering problems with the new dam. Any structural damage could endanger many lives in Brightwater. Item 40. Tahuna Nui is the jewel in Nelson's crown, providing accommodation and numerous outdoor activities. An August 2004 Tahuna structure plan was commissioned by NCC, but never enacted even in part. Tahuna Nui is a political football, kicked around and totally ignored, except by property developers, affluent retirees who have come in from major centres. If Tahuna Nui is developed to anywhere near the size of that envisaged, the 4-lane through road, calming areas on the hillside, and the closure of Rocks Road due to tidal activity averaging 4 times a year, it's hard to imagine how a smooth flow of traffic into and out of the city can be maintained or supported by the current minimal thickness of asphalt, which is insufficient to adequately cope with the greater volumes of heavier traffic. Infrastructure also comes into the equation. If there are 6-storey units, we have a problem of sewage and disposing of wastewater. Now, having seen 70 years of change in this area, much of which has not benefited residents or businesses, I can only say that my feelings and comments are akin to the old Spates advertisement punchline. I might be old, but I'm not stupid. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Trevor. I will see if there's any questions. No, you've made it very clear there are no questions. So thank you very much for your submission today, and do have a good weekend. And we'll.
Thank you for your time. Goodbye.
Cheers. Thanks. Yeah, Hill. True.
Sorry?
Yeah, Hill. I'm not sure. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Are you there?
Say again? Yeah.
Yeah, Hill. Yes.
Kia ora, Council. Yakal Upson here. Yeah, no worries.
So welcome, and we'll let you get on with your submission. A bell will ring at 8 minutes.
Yeah, no worries. Well, good afternoon to you, council members, and I'm very pleased to see some other welcome faces in here. Rachel, Bruno, Lindsay, Tim and Barb watching. Great to see you in the room. I'll be reasonably brief. This is off the cuff. A note that I'll return to at the end of this section in regards to community engagement. I wanted to primarily begin by acknowledging the human component in these processes. I wanted to speak to the treatment of accessibility within the strategic plan and close with some final notes. In reading what I've found sufficient time to, and in the conversations with council members through public consultation and otherwise over the past couple of weeks, One thing I've identified is perhaps a certain level of vulnerability or lack of vulnerability around the human aspects of these decision-making processes. And I really want to acknowledge that the underpinnings here are some very uncomfortable truths. This is processes, there's members in the room here who are making careers out of understanding necessary adaptation to climate change, necessary adaptation to energy and resource availability, and the best environmental interests in our region and community. And I want to acknowledge that as they speak to you, each of those individuals are a human being alongside yourselves in their imperfection, but in their commitment as well. And I think there might be a certain perception of councillors and of council staff not being able to express that vulnerability and that fellowship. I would love to, yes, I would hope that we can begin to break that down and further earnest conversations, because I've absolutely found the most value in these past weeks in the one-to-one conversations and in close, more private ones where emotions have been able to be expressed. It's in doing so that we break through some of the barriers that I believe are holding back important and brave action. Now, the treatment of accessibility, there's 3 points that jumped out at me here. One was a focus on consumerism rather than experiential activities. The second concerns the assumption that proximity is equal to access. And the third is perhaps one of deviation from international best practice. In regards to consumerism versus experiential activities, I notice, and I reviewed this quickly ahead of the meeting within the FDS technical draft technical documentation, looked at this access model, and which is a listed set of activities. And the very format of the document, suggests that perhaps the first things we should be engaging with are doctors and pharmacies to heal ourselves, clinics, dentists, supermarkets, all the way down through employment, schools. And if you make it to the very bottom of the set of tables, you might find some recreation and open space. Those primarily listed activities are very consumerist based. Services, products from shops. And I believe by very nature, that focus leads to what can become an exclusive system. Activities which are paid to participate, for example. This ties my first and second point in the sense that proximity assumes access. The calculations have been done around this, what I understand to be a 30-minute accessibility radio. But the mere act of reaching a destination doesn't necessarily mean it's unlocked to a user, to an actor, to a local. This model appears to overlook demographic, socioeconomic factors as well. This brings me back to my first point around experiences rather than consumerist activities. I think other cities have done a very good job of this. If we look at, I look at Wellington, where in my experience, we were never more than 15 to 20 minutes away from a walkway, crisscrossed interlinked paths, places that took you tangibly away from the rush and bustle of the city, out into a forest or adjacent space. They led you to other services, to friends, places of cultural activity. Christchurch as well has put forward first and foremost of their planning the intent to be a garden city and to be bikeable. But in the prioritisation throughout the plan and the seeming adhesion to continued low density greenfields development, I'm seeing no strategy, no consideration, no concept of this focus on consumerism. Jumping to my third point, the basis of design being potentially flawed. As I believe, I haven't caught it yet, I hope to come back, but I believe Lindsay Wood's spoken to this in terms of access radius and the fact that a 30-minute access radius is going to cover 4 times the space that a 15-minute might. So what was the basis for this? I would like to inquire, and who signed off that was an acceptable level to be set for the region, particularly when there's strong research behind 15-minute cities, as this relates to how far people are typically willing to go. When was the last time you heard someone say, I'm just going to pop down to the shops, I'll be back in an hour and a half. It'll take me half an hour to get there, half an hour to get back. Yeah, right. In terms of access, we live in the rural Moutere, and for argument's sake, I could be in Motueka in 45 minutes on a manual push bike. That's what I used to do. I don't consider that accessibility by any means. So we need to be very careful that we are adhering to best known models, and that we're being very careful about the inputs, the scope and limitation of these calculations we make. I'd close on that just suggesting again that cities and systems focused on mental, cultural and physical health are inclusive by their very nature. And while communities that contain, and additionally communities that contain complete solutions that aren't choosing to outsource to other areas are truly accessible. A reoccurring theme that I've seen in public talks is that of centralised job accessibility in the industry, and here I'm talking about Richmond South area and the development along the main road. Speaking again as a Moutere resident, it's not accessible here if I have everything but a job and I'm travelling 45 minutes. That's outsourcing. No way. I'm going to wrap it up there. Look, I've found it incredibly challenging preparing for this presentation, particularly because of lack of time. It seems that the harder any of us are out working on some of these issues, the less time we have for this engagement. And so I want to finish beginning with a reflection of positive experience that I've had with the direct engagement workshops that have been held over the past week or two. I was only aware of those via second-hand passed on Facebook links to the event, but I did attend. Sometimes I was only one of a handful of individuals, and another time I was the only person there. I think we could build engagement, but they were very effective. It was very nice to sit down and have a real conversation, not this sort of hurrying something together and presenting it in a one-way mode. I think we absolutely need to address better advertisement of consultations in the region. I would like to see permanent billboards outside of Richmond and on the main roads and on the way through to Nelson there, advertising all of these public engagements upcoming, because as engaged as I think I am, I only became aware of this process maybe 2 weeks back through the work of others, and that really shocks me. Finally, from the conversations I've had with staff members, and I won't mention any names in confidence, but I get a strong impression that we are dealing with a certain strata of what might be conservative attitudes within local council, and that strata appears to be roadblocking a great deal of hard work, progressive thinking and future-minded strategy from making its way from council teams into our region. It's very difficult for me to address that in a quantitative manner, but I would really urge everyone sitting in the room today to look at yourselves carefully and at your colleagues and have a good thought towards what you might be deliberately or inadvertently forestalling for our region. We have very little time to act, and we need bold, what might be perceived as aggressive or difficult to palate ideas. Thank you for your time. any questions.
Thank you for your submission. I'll see if there are any submissions. No, it appears not. So thank you for your submission. We appreciate your time making that and coming in today to talk to us. So have a good weekend, and we'll move on to the next submitter, Mr. Hellier.
Got it.
Can you go to gallery? Mr. Hellier, are you there? Are we ahead, are we? 4 minutes, so we better, yes. Yes. So while we are waiting, at the end, do we want to go round and give information, or shall we leave that to next week? What do you think? Oh, think about the slow typers in the room.
We can do them now, or we can.
Well, yeah, I think we're
maybe
just.
a combination with lots of things, maybe.
Yeah, well, that's true. Would that be all right with staff if after we hear from Mr. Hellier, we went round and just any issues we want more? Yeah, and then if he comes in, can you just let us know and we'll pause? So who wants to start? You use your microphone.
Just one question for Barry, perhaps. In Bruno's submission, he mentioned about farmers moving soil without consent. Is that allowed or is it not allowed?
Not allowed. It's not allowed.
Well, that depends, I guess.
Yeah. Depends. Good question, but usually.
If it's identified as a wetlands, then you can't. It's now under freshwater regulations, a prohibited activity to basically fill in a wetland or effectively do anything to a wetland now is very, very difficult, but it's prohibited activity to remove or infill a wetland. You cannot do that. If it's dry land and it doesn't have wetland vegetation, then you can move quite a bit of soil under our permitted activity rules for land disturbance. But given the area that he was talking about, it looks like it's a wetland. I think you'd struggle under the regulations.
Is it defined as a wetland in any of our plans or whatever, Barry, or not?
I'd have to have a look at our mapped wetlands, but the definition under the regulations, if it has more than 50% wetland species, then and intermittently wet, then it's classified as a wetland. So it doesn't have to be mapped or identified. Right. It depends on the composition of vegetation and plant species there as well. So it's site by site basis, but the new regulations are very strict in terms of wetlands.
Because very close to the land he's talking about, there's a very large, I suppose, hand-drawn sign which says landfill wanted urgently. There's a big mobile phone number there, and there's heaps of soil, probably as high as the fence out there, and probably the best by 100 metres in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So I think that's where Bruno may have been referring to that. And so, within the last 2 or 3 weeks, heaps of clay.
We're probably getting into a resource consenting matter, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you. I can't comment any further on it, but that's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Just a few questions. First one relates to Mapua wetland area, and we've had the Wildlife Subcommittee of Mapua and Districts Community Association and others submit on that. So I'd just be keen to see like an overlay map of where the wetland sits in relation to the FDS maps. I think I got the areas, but it hasn't been fully clarified. But then also what those ecological values are of that wetland area. So that's my questions in relation to that. Then also from that submission was the consideration of wildlife corridors and biodiversity. And there's been a few submissions who have talked about wildlife corridors. not just in Mapua, but also in Golden Bay. And so just consideration of, are there areas we need to look at wildlife corridors? My next one was in the MCA, if we've assessed reverse sensitivity or land use compatibility as part of our assessments. That's as per the Fonterra submission, but I think the same applies for any site, because you can then end up with, you know, more creep. Because, you know, if you end up with small cut-off areas that aren't really viable, that also then makes them no longer productive because they're too small to be productive. So that leads to those next sites turning into, you know, having no option in inverted commas other than housing. So just looking at, you know, does this leave any, you know, orphan sites? Is there land use compatibility issues, etc.? David Eyre said, I thought I heard him say that we don't need to consider the Zero Carbon Act. Just if I can get clarification on that, because I would not have thought that we didn't need to consider it. There was a submitter who raised the levels of service for parks and reserves. And I guess my question is probably just the broader one around amenity. And that probably also goes probably more so for intensification, because the 5% he was talking about, it's actually 5% of the value of the development, but I'm just wondering whether there's different metrics that are used for more intensified areas, just whether we need to consider how that is done. And then also in the area of amenity, please tell me if I'm talking too fast. I can duplicate and email these through if need be. Also, just in relation to amenity, we have had quite a lot of discussion about shade, lack of sun and other impacts there. And so just comment on whether those rules are currently adequately met within our RMPs, or if rule changes would be required. Mark Lyle mentioned affordability of intensified options. And of course, we've had other submitters who have mentioned that intensified options actually become cheaper, whereas he talked about them not being cheaper because of, you know, once you get into height. And certainly based on our current deliveries of multi-storey dwellings, they are generally, you know, 7 figures. And so if intensification is indeed to support affordability, just what are the conditions that support that, I guess. I had some questions from yesterday's submissions from Nelson Tasman 2050. There was a 31457, sorry, I haven't written the person's name, but that they mentioned a carrying capacity study. And so just whether that's been encompassed within work we've done, or that is a piece of work that staff think we need to do. I would be interested in that. There was also comments, and I have already raised it, sorry, mixed use on Queen Street, because I know there were previously discussions when I was well, I know I'm sitting around the table now, but sitting around the table here in a different capacity, prior to the upgrade of Queen Street, there was actually discussions and suggestions to do mixed-use development around the south side of Queen Street. So I'd be interested to know why they weren't reconsidered. Urban Regeneration Agency, now that might be considered outside the scope, and I know to set up a CCO we need a full SCP process, but just maybe how something like that could be progressed as the two councils, whether that's something that would need to be separately referred to the joint committee for discussion. I don't necessarily expect staff to do the research on it, but just what would be the process for looking at that as an option, and whether it's an initial, does the joint committee, want to authorise probably funding to initially get some work done on looking into that as an option. And then urban rural boundaries. There was that mention of QLDC as our next submitter here. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Okay. I will stop there, and I probably do. There has been a lot of commentary on outcome 5, with the phrase meet demand being the incorrect metric. So I wouldn't mind some consideration on that. Question 15 in our survey talked about intensification happening very slowly over time. And I guess I'd just like to, sort of pick up on that, and that probably relates also back to that was submitter 31459 mentioned that, but it also relates back, I guess, to the uptake rates that have been discussed by previous submitters. Submission 31316, they mentioned T114 having higher capacity. So just if that could be looked at. And similarly, submitter 31457 mentioned site T17 also having higher capacity than what we'd identified. I'll have a breather and let someone else go.
Have you got any questions?
Yes, I do. Well, I have actually addressed all my questions within an email, so we'll just keep that communication going until those questions are answered accordingly from the officers. Right?
You're happy with that?
I'm happy with that.
Thank you. Councillor McGurk.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I fired through a few questions to Claire and Susan earlier today, so they've been acknowledged. Just some follow-up questions as a result of this afternoon's presentations. I'm just wondering, a couple of people talked about incentives and disincentives, and I'm just wondering if we could have sort of some commentary on our DC's policy here. I am aware that some submitters have talked about it. Doesn't make a huge amount of difference, but has been referenced by a couple of submitters about our regulatory processes and fees and charges, and if providing some incentives or incentivising the behaviours that we're wanting to see. So I'd appreciate if we could have some feedback on that one. I think I said about earlier on about the talked about the soil capacity and productivity for T136, but that's keeps coming up again, so that probably reinforces that specific issue for many. Just at Mr. Dr. Lemke's submission today, about 5%, I think Councillor Eager did make reference to that. I'd like that sort of clarified. What are the rules we've got currently around the Mapua, Ruby Bay areas? With that, yeah, Mr. Tom Kennedy from the Save the Maitai talked about the huge amount of infrastructure required in the Nile and Milton Street areas to support that. Just report, what's been planned in terms of the infrastructure upgrades that are already. I think they're in they're already in the LTP. But can we just have a summary of where we're at with that and just confirmation that the infrastructure that's being talked about, the capacity is there to handle that. Again, something that Councillor Eager mentioned before about the CCTO for development. Sort of the approach Councillor Eager's taken, but perhaps we have some reference to the Auckland model, how that works. The is it a Ikiki Panuku. And just I think just have a summary of how big it is. And I know Mr. Lindsay Wood made reference to the Building Research Association NZ brands standards for low emission or emission reduction. So perhaps we can have some reference to that. And I'm sure I've got some more questions, but I'll email them through.
Thank you. Councillor Malin.
I've only got one, and it relates to the area at Rangihi Hata Head. And is that location in our proposed O&L? Because they haven't been declared yet, but I know there's wetlands in there. Because one of the residents in there was ended up with an abatement notice because he filled in a wetland. So I'm just wondering if it is.
Thank you. Just a few from myself. And I'll start off with yesterday's ones. So we had at least a couple of submitters talk about rural residential. I think both of them are not currently proposed in the FDS. Just wondered if we could have, is that something we can do? And do we need to have a look at that? And also perhaps particularly the one at Spring Grove, just around what infrastructure requirements there would be for that one. And then moving on to T136 of Mr. Malcolm's, just if we could have some further information around if that was proposed or even if we're going to consider that, if it's desired to seek further information on that or even consider it. And then also, and I think it was Mike Lynch that spoke, who was an adjoining neighbour, just and not necessarily on himself, but what the effects would be on people around there if that development was to go ahead. And also, as part of the Malcolm submission, Mr. Dick referred to another 1,500 hectares suitable for rural residential. Just if that's something we even want to look at or consider, or so that time we can perhaps advise them what the outcome is of their submission. And then just, we've had it through most of the days, the rate of uptake seems to vary on who's submitting. Can we have some clarity on what we've used and what the likely rate of uptake is across the different zones? Another one that's been raised in the community, and I think it's been raised by others, the effective cost of council charges on development. Because I heard this morning that up to 40% of a section price in Auckland is affected by council charges, and because we've built in the last 3 years, I've worked it out in my head, and I don't think our rate is anywhere near that, but I would be interested in what it is generally, so that if we're using, some people advocate that we should use that as a tool to slow development. So it'd be interesting to know what it is. I'm only looking for an average across the 2 districts. And I have, because I've been chairing today, I had 1 or 2 others, but I haven't obviously had time to flick from your notes. So if there's anything further, I'm happy to email them. Councillor Eager, did you have any more you want to raise now?
No, look, I'll email them through. Yeah, because I've also got some from submitters who aren't speaking, but
yeah, same.
They also might be speaking Tuesday.
Yeah,
so I'll
Friday.
hold off some until after Tuesday as well. Thank you.
Right, thank you for that. It appears that Mr. Hellier hasn't come, and I think we've given him a reasonable time at 20 minutes past his allotted time. So I wonder if you would, Ina, I will get this right by the end of the hearing, I'm sure. And my apologies for pronunciation's not my greatest strength, I must confess. Wondered if you would do the closing karakia, please.
Oh, kia ora. So my name's Ina. It's Scottish.
Okay, Ina.
So thank you. Would you like, are you sure you want me to say karaki? You don't want a long one, or you just want to say a short one? Or?
Just whatever you feel is appropriate.
All right, well, let's go. Karaki tātou. E tō mātou mātou te rangi kia tapata waingo tā mātou rangi te tankia me tai ai ki unu ki pēra ki te tōno ki tō te rangi. O mai kia mātou nānei he tātou mātou ba tēnei rā. Muri o mātou haramai mātou hope muri nei. E o tā hanganara kia mātou, ia wei mātou i kawi whakawaia. Engari whaki o ringa mātou i te kino. No hukta ranga te tanta kaha me te kōrea. Ake, 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 amene.
Thank you very much. Kia ora. So
all right, see you next week.
Weekend, Dinah.
Thank you. Same to you all.
Yes, thank you, and don't all read too much. And thank you to the people that have participated on Zoom today. We appreciate your input. Thank you. And we would adjourn the meeting to Tuesday at 9 a.m.
Kia ora tātou. Ka kite anō.